Hi guys. Tonight we travel back to a time when warmth was a luxury, when the world outside was blanketed in snow and darkness seemed to stretch forever. You imagine yourself in a vast stone hall, the air heavy with the scent of smoke and damp wool. The candles flicker weakly against the draught, their tiny flames bending under the invisible breath of winter. Somewhere in the distance, you hear the low groan of timber beams shifting in the cold, and you realize there's no central heating, no glass windows to hold the warmth, no electric light to comfort your eyes. The night belongs to the frost. You probably wouldn't survive this without a dozen layers and a very forgiving immune system. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me, where are you listening from? And what time is it where you are? Now, dim the lights, let your shoulders sink, and imagine stepping into the chill of a medieval night. You trudge through the echoing corridors of a castle, each step stirring dust and cold air. The floor is bare stone, icy beneath your worn leather shoes. The walls, built to last centuries, are thick enough to muffle most sound, yet not enough to keep the cold from creeping in. Torches line the hall, sputtering with that particular hiss of oil catching fire, but the warmth they give barely reaches your fingertips. People of this age understood the cold not as a passing discomfort, but as a constant companion. You pass a servant carrying a bucket of glowing embers, carefully shielding it from draughts. That small pot might be all that stands between a noble family and a night of sleepless shivering. In these vast stone fortresses, fires burned day and night, not for decoration but survival. Chimneys were still new inventions in much of Europe. Many halls had only open hearths, with smoke curling upward and escaping through a hole in the roof. The smell of wood smoke clung to everything, clothing, hair, and the very air you breathed. You might think castles were cozy havens, but even kings slept in rooms that could freeze water overnight. The thick walls held out invaders, not the cold. Without insulation, every gust of winter air seeped through cracks and arrow slits. Historians still argue whether the grandeur of castles ever compensated for their discomfort. You imagine servants hurrying to hang heavy tapestries, not for decoration but as makeshift insulation. In one corner, a massive four-poster bed looms, draped in layers of velvet and fur. A nobleman will soon retreat into that small island of warmth, the curtains pulled tight to trap his body heat. But even he will sleep with a woolen cap, for the air that escapes the covers will bite like frost. The rich and poor alike understood that night was a battle. The difference was that the rich fought it with silken servants, while the poor fought it with straw and faith. Outside the castle, the wind howls through the village. You can picture thatched cottages crouched low under snow, their roofs heavy and their doors barred with planks to keep the storm at bay. Inside, the smell of smoke and humanity blends into something earthy and thick. A peasant family huddles together on a shared bed, stuffed with straw, the faint glow of a dying fire painting their faces in orange and shadow. It's a hard life, but they know its rhythm, the endless winter, the short days, the long nights that seem to stretch forever. The medieval world knew darkness more intimately than we ever could. Once the sun set, the day was truly over. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, so most people lived by firelight or moonlight. The night was both feared and respected, a realm of rest, prayer, and superstition. You can almost feel the way silence deepened after dusk, interrupted only by the crackle of fire or the occasional howl of a wolf. A quirky detail historians love to mention is how some castles built their staircases clockwise to give defenders an advantage. But that meant cold air spiraled upward, through the same stairwells. The chill that swept up the steps was like an invisible river. Servants sometimes slept in the corridors, simply to be close to the embers or to guard them through the night. Imagine them curled under cloaks, dreaming in fits, the sound of wind mixing with snores and muttered prayers. Every object around you serves the same purpose: survival. The wooden shutters, the woven rushes on the floor, the fur pelts on chairs. People used everything they had to create a buffer between their bodies and the winter's bite. Sometimes, even the animals played a role. Dogs, particularly small lap dogs, were kept close, not for companionship but for warmth. Some historians suggest noble women would place them in bed first, using them as living hot water bottles before slipping under the covers themselves. The scent of tallow candles fills your nose, thick and greasy, mixed with smoke from the hearth. You can almost taste the bitterness of it, feel the air clinging to your throat. Yet, there's comfort too. The fire flickers across stone, and the shadows dance on carved walls. You hear a lull in the wind outside, and for a moment, you sense why people found peace here despite the hardship. The darkness, the warmth of a small flame, and the quiet of a world asleep. It's a fragile balance that humans have always sought. You think of how easily we forget this struggle, our modern nights made bright and warm by machines. In the Middle Ages, winter shaped the soul. People learned patience, thrift, and endurance through those endless cold months. They watched the frost form on windowless walls, and they found beauty even there. It was a time when the stars seemed closer, when every spark in the hearth felt like a miracle. As you drift deeper into the story, you can feel that same ancient calm settling over you. The air is still cold, but now it's a familiar cold, one that reminds you that warmth means more when you have fought for it. The medieval world understood that lesson better than anyone. The night stretches on, the fire sighs, and you begin to sense the rhythm of an age long past a world asleep under a frozen sky. You step outside the castle walls and into the village, where the smell of wood smoke clings to the air like a second skin. The snow has stopped for now, but the world remains hushed, heavy, and brittle. Beneath the low thatched roofs, peasants curl together in their one-room cottages. You duck through a crooked doorway, and the scent of soot and damp straw greets you instantly. Inside, the only light comes from a small hearth in the center of the room, its flame barely alive, flickering over rough clay walls blackened by years of smoke. You can taste the air, dense and stale, a mixture of old meals, unwashed wool, and ash. You crouch near the fire. A woman sits on a three-legged stool, wrapped in a patched shawl, stirring something thick in a pot. Beside her, two children sleep in a corner, buried under a pile of coarse blankets and old clothes. A man lies nearby, his breath fogging faintly in the cold air. This is not comfort, but endurance. They do not expect to be warm. They expect to survive until dawn. Their bed is little more than a raised wooden platform, covered in straw and old linen sacks stuffed with whatever material could be spared. Sometimes it was hay or dried bracken, sometimes even moss from the woods. Historians note that the straw was rarely changed, and the smell must have been unforgettable. You lie down on such a bed, the straw crunching beneath you, the scent of earth and animal lingering in the fibers. It pricks at your skin through the thin cloth, and the faint rustle makes every movement sound like whispers. To make it through the night, peasants relied on layers, not of fabric but of bodies. Families slept together, sometimes 3 generations sharing one bed, or at least one pile of straw. The heat from each person's body was worth more than any luxury blanket. There was no sense of privacy, but there was security in the closeness. You can almost feel the press of shoulders, the mingling of breaths, the heartbeat of the sleeping household. Even the family's few animals, chickens or goats, might huddle nearby, their warmth contributing to the fragile cocoon against the winter. The walls themselves seemed to sigh, made of wattle and daub sticks woven together and plastered with clay and dung. They leak both sound and cold. You can hear the moan of the wind outside, but you can also hear every cough, every shift of straw, every murmur of someone dreaming. The thatched roof above is rimed with frost, and sometimes it drips as the heat from the hearth rises. You imagine the slow, irregular plop of melted ice hitting the floor. a rhythm that marks the night's passing. A quirky bit of trivia from chroniclers of the time mentions that some villagers spread herbs like lavender or wormwood among the bedding. They believed the scent could ward off pests and sickness. Perhaps it worked. Perhaps it didn't. Historians still debate how much of medieval medicine was practical and how much was desperate hope. But even a faint scent of herbs would have brought a kind of comfort, a reminder of summer's gentler days. You glance at the hearth again. It is the heart of this tiny home, but the firewood supply is always uncertain. Many peasants gathered fallen branches or dried dung because proper logs were too costly. When the flames died, the room would cool quickly, and breath would frost in the air. Children sometimes woke in the night to rekindle the embers with a few scraps of wood, blowing gently until the glow returned. The sound of that faint exhalation against ash might be one of the most intimate sounds of winter life. The room is small, but every object carries purpose. A pot suspended by a chain above the fire, a rough bench, a single chest for clothes, and perhaps a few wooden bowls. The walls are bare except for smoke stains and the occasional charm or carving. Many believed such tokens protected the home from spirits that roamed at night. In the long silence of winter, imagination filled the darkness easily. The line between superstition and survival blurred until they felt like the same thing. You notice how the cold touches everything. Metal tools left near the door glint with frost. The bread, left on a shelf overnight, hardens like stone. Even the dog in the corner twitches in its sleep, tail curled tight to conserve heat. There is no escape from the season, only strategies to endure it. The villagers know this, and they do not complain. To them, winter is simply a test, one they will face again and again. You imagine how quiet the village must be after dusk. No laughter, no chatter beyond the low hum of the wind and the occasional bark of a distant dog. The smoke rising from chimneys is the only sign of life, twisting into the pale moonlight. Every door is barred, not just against the cold but against the unknown. The night feels vast, eternal, and yet somehow comforting. If you listen carefully, you might hear faint singing. Sometimes families passed the time before sleep with hymns or stories, the rhythm of voices blending with the sound of the crackling fire. Oral storytelling thrived in this dim world. Legends of saints, of ghosts, of lost travelers caught in the snow. Such stories warmed the mind when the body could not. It is hard not to admire their resilience. Modern life has made us soft against discomfort, yet they managed entire seasons with little more than determination. You wonder how they found rest, wrapped in rough wool and straw, yet they did. Perhaps it was exhaustion, perhaps it was acceptance. Either way, the stillness of those nights held its own kind of peace. The woman by the fire finishes stirring her pot and ladles out a bit for herself. It smells faintly of barley and onion, thin but nourishing. She eats slowly, her breath steaming with each spoonful. Soon, she will climb into bed beside her family. The embers glow faintly as she settles in, pulling the worn blanket over her shoulders. Her eyes close, her face softens, and for a while, the winter ceases to exist. You sit beside her for a moment, listening to the rhythm of sleep around you. The fire crackles softly, the children murmur in dreams, and the wind presses against the walls. The world is still, caught between freezing and surviving, but here, in this fragile warmth, life continues, and so do you, drifting deeper into the slow heartbeat of a medieval winter night. You begin to notice something unusual about the rhythm of the night. After a few hours of sleep, you find yourself waking up, eyes blinking in the faint glow of embers. The room is quiet, yet alive with the soft movements of others stirring too. At first, it feels accidental, as though your body simply cannot rest through the cold. But in the medieval world, this was normal. People did not sleep through the night in one long stretch. Instead, they had what chroniclers called the first sleep and the second sleep. two distinct phases separated by an hour or two of wakefulness. Evidence from diaries, court records, and letters from across Europe reveals this curious rhythm. A peasant might rise after midnight, poke the fire, check the animals, or murmur a few prayers before returning to bed. A noble might read from a psalter or speak quietly with a servant. The night was not divided by fear but by habit. Sleep came in intervals, shaped by the natural patterns of darkness and the cold. You sit up on your straw mattress and watch the faint red light on the hearth. The air is sharp in your nose. A few others in the room have risen as well. One child whimpers, half awake, while an old man pulls on his cloak and steps outside to relieve himself. The snow glows faintly beneath the moon. This is the hour between sleeps, the calmest moment of the night when time feels suspended. A curious little note in some medieval medical texts suggests that this waking period was considered healthy. Physicians believed the body needed time to digest food or release vapors before resuming rest. Others thought it allowed the soul to wander freely in prayer or contemplation. You imagine sitting by the hearth with a mug of ale, the taste faintly sour but warming, and your thoughts drifting somewhere between dream and awareness. There is still disagreement among researchers about how universal this pattern really was. Some argue that it belonged mainly to rural communities, whose daily routines followed sunrise and sunset. Others believe even city dwellers, with their candlelit homes, followed the same rhythm. Whatever the truth, the evidence is strong enough to suggest that this segmented sleep was not a rarity, but a part of life's ordinary pulse. You can picture it clearly now. The first sleep falls like a heavy blanket. People slip into dreams filled with the sounds of winter, of wind moving through eaves, of creaking beams and distant howls. Then comes the middle hour, when the fire has burned low and the body grows restless. Someone rises, throws another log on the coals, stretches stiff limbs, maybe whispers to a neighbor. Then, just as quietly, they settle back, surrendering again to the second sleep until dawn. In that twilight space between the two rests, people often turned inward. They prayed, recited psalms, or reflected on their sins and hopes. Some records from monasteries suggest that monks even timed their night prayers around this rhythm, calling it the watch. It was both a spiritual exercise and a necessity, for the cold demanded movement. To sit still too long was to invite numbness. There are even stories of lovers meeting during the middle hour, stealing moments in the soft darkness while the world slumbered. The cold may have frozen the land, but it could not quench curiosity or desire. One old folk tale speaks of a shepherd who left his bed during the watch and followed a strange light across the fields, only to find it was the reflection of the moon in ice. Whether true or not, such tales reveal how the mind played tricks when the body was caught between sleeping and waking. The scientific understanding of this pattern has fascinated modern researchers. When people are placed in complete darkness without clocks or artificial light, their bodies often revert to a similar cycle, sleeping for 4 hours, waking for 1 or 2, then sleeping again. It seems our ancestors were not strange but rather perfectly attuned to the rhythms of the natural world. The industrial age changed that, compressing rest into a single stretch to match the demands of schedules and light bulbs. As you watch the room settle again, you realize how peaceful this rhythm must have been. There was time for dreaming, time for thought, and time for prayer, all folded neatly into the long winter night. No alarms, no rush, just the steady flow of human breath and flickering firelight. It was a conversation between the body and the dark. An odd little custom mentioned in some village records notes that people sometimes used this midnight waking to check on neighbors or even tend to small tasks, such as mending clothing or kneading bread dough to rise by morning. Life did not stop completely, even when the world was asleep. Perhaps that is why the cold seemed less cruel then. It was simply part of the rhythm. You lean back, the straw shifting beneath you, and close your eyes again. Outside, frost crystals glint faintly on the window frame. The faint crack of cooling wood echoes through the room. It is time to drift back into the second sleep, the one that carries you closer to morning. As you sink into it, you understand that in the medieval night, rest was not an escape from life, but a slow, breathing conversation with it. You wake before dawn, wrapped in a bundle of rough blankets that scratch your skin but keep you alive. The fire has burned down to a few red coals, and the air feels like the inside of a cave. Every breath fogs in front of your face, and your hands sting as you stretch them from beneath the covers. The first thought that passes through your sleepy mind is not about breakfast or work, but about warmth, how to keep it, how to make it last. In the medieval world, warmth was an art form. According to most historical records, people relied on layering not only for travel and work, but even for bed. Sleepwear was not the delicate luxury we imagine today. It was a fortress of fabric. You start with a linen shift or shirt, soft from repeated washing but often patched and worn thin. Over that, you pull on woolen hose that itch faintly but trap heat better than anything else. A cap for your head, gloves for your hands, even a scarf or kerchief tied snugly beneath your chin. The beds themselves became part of this system. You can feel it as you press your hand against the rough wool blanket, heavy and slightly damp from the night air. Above that, another layer waits, perhaps fur or thick woven cloth. Each sheet, each cover, each garment forms a barrier between your body and the cold world beyond. The poor might rely on coarse wool or patched rags, while the wealthy enjoyed linen sheets, feather mattresses, and imported fur throws. Yet the principle was the same. Trap every bit of heat you can. Archaeological findings from preserved homes and burial sites confirm that layering was central to winter survival. Even corpses were sometimes buried with multiple layers of fabric, suggesting the practice was deeply ingrained. It was not just fashion, it was instinct. You can almost hear the soft rustle of fabric as people bundled themselves in preparation for sleep, the faint sigh of comfort as warmth began to build beneath the weight of the covers. A curious note appears in a few medieval household manuals describing the art of the bed. Servants were instructed to layer the bedclothes in a specific order, the bottom sheet to absorb sweat, the middle for insulation, and the top to block drafts. The result was a kind of textile sandwich, a microclimate of survival. It is oddly scientific, long before science had the language to explain it. There is still no full agreement among scholars about exactly how widespread these methods were. Some argue that elaborate layering was mainly practiced in wealthy households, while others insist that even peasants knew the principle well. The lack of written records from the poor leaves the question open, but you can imagine that experience, rather than books, taught them what worked. The cold was the best teacher of all. You rise from the bed and wrap a cloak around your shoulders. The texture of wool feels rough but comforting, the faint scent of smoke still clinging to it from last night's fire. The cloak is a constant companion, worn indoors and out. In many households, it doubled as an extra blanket, draped over sleeping bodies when the air turned biting. It was common for travelers to sleep fully clothed, boots and all, to save themselves from the shock of rewarming frozen garments in the morning. One particularly interesting piece of trivia from French inventories describes how wealthier families stored their winter bedding in cedar chests during the summer months, along with dried herbs like rosemary or lavender to deter moths. When winter returned, the beds were made anew, and the faint scent of herbs filled the chambers. You can imagine the moment the blankets were unfolded, the smell of last summer's warmth released into the cold air. As you walk through a small chamber, the sight of a servant shaking out sheets fills the air with dust that glows in the pale morning light. She hums quietly, shaking layer after layer, then lays them neatly on the bed frame. The simple rhythm of the task seems eternal, a small act of defiance against the cold. She knows that these layers, once tucked and smoothed, are more than fabric. They are the thin boundary between comfort and suffering. Most researchers agree that fabric choice often reflected social class. Linen, though breathable, was expensive and prized by the wealthy, while coarse wool was the commoner's shield. Fur, especially from animals like rabbit or fox, was considered a mark of both luxury and vanity. In northern regions, even simpler folk might line their clothing with scraps of fur or felt for extra warmth. Nothing was wasted when the cold pressed in. An eccentric little tradition mentioned in English village records tells of families hanging their bedclothes by the fire each morning to dry the night's moisture and smoke away insects. The process filled the room with the scent of warm fabric and soot, and children often wrapped themselves in the heated sheets for a few stolen moments before bed. It must have been bliss, that fleeting touch of warmth before returning to the chill. You stand beside the window, the frost tracing white veins across the wooden frame. You touch it with your finger and feel how quickly the warmth of your skin fades. The contrast between outside and inside, between cold and comfort, is delicate. It reminds you of how humans learn to live between those extremes, always improvising, always layering. When you finally lie back down, cocooned beneath blankets, you understand why the medieval night was survivable. It was not brute endurance, but a careful dance of habit, fabric, and timing. The cold pressed in from all sides, but people found small victories in every thread. The room grows quiet again, the fire reduced to soft ash. You breathe slowly, surrounded by layers that have trapped not just warmth, but the faint smell of life itself. Outside, frost glitters on the thatch, and a rooster calls somewhere in the distance. You close your eyes, sinking into the cradle of wool and linen, grateful for every fibre that keeps the winter at bay. The morning breaks slowly, a grey light filtering through cracks in the shutters. The air feels colder now that the fire has died, the kind of cold that makes your breath come out in short bursts of mist. You stir, unwilling to leave the bed, yet aware that someone must tend to the hearth or the day will begin in ice. You slip from the covers, each movement releasing a small cloud of your own warmth into the room, and pad toward the hearth where a few faint red embers still smoulder beneath a crust of ash. The medieval hearth was more than a source of heat, it was the center of life. According to most written records from the period, it served for cooking, drying clothes, heating water, and providing light. But at night, it was a lifeline. Families treated the fire like a living creature that needed feeding, protection, and care. You kneel beside it now, the stones cold under your knees, and stir the ashes gently with an iron poker. A faint crackle answers you, and a soft thread of orange glows in the grey. If you fail to coax it back to life, you face the misery of starting a new flame from scratch. Fire-making in winter was no easy task. Flint and steel were clumsy companions, and damp tinder often refused to catch. It is said that some people carried small pots of glowing embers from one house to another, so that the neighborhood never lost fire entirely. In some communities, the village smith was entrusted to keep a constant flame through the cold months. A trace of this ancient dependence survives in the word focus, which once meant hearth in Latin. One curious record from a 14th century manor mentions that servants sometimes slept near the fireplace to guard the embers. They called them slumberers by the fire, and it was their duty to ensure the coals never fully died. You can picture them curled against the wall, wrapped in old cloaks, faces flickering in the dim glow as they drift in and out of sleep. Their dreams must have smelled of smoke. Modern researchers have found evidence in soot patterns and charred hearthstones that medieval homes often burned smoky, low-oxygen fires, since chimneys were rare in earlier centuries. The smoke filled the upper air of the room before seeping out through a hole in the roof. The effect was suffocating, yet strangely protective, since the fumes helped preserve wooden beams from insects. The air inside such a home must have been heavy, the smell of wood and soot saturating every breath. Yet for the people living there, it was simply the scent of safety. There remains some debate among scholars about how widespread the use of proper chimneys was before the late Middle Ages. Some argue they appeared in northern Europe by the 12th century, others claim they did not become common until the 15th. Either way, you can imagine the transformation when smoke finally had somewhere to go. A clear room must have felt like a luxury. But in this moment, In this peasant home, the air still swirls thick and grey, curling through the thatch and out into the pale sky. You add another stick to the coals, and the spark catches slowly, spreading from ember to bark. The warmth grows in thin waves, touching your hands, your face, then fading again into the vastness of the room. It is not enough to heat the air, only to take the edge off the bite. The woman beside you coughs lightly, covering her mouth with a shawl. The sound echoes in the small space, and you realize how fragile every comfort is. In grander houses, the hearths were monumental. You can imagine standing in a great hall where the fire pit sits in the center, flames reaching high toward a smoky ceiling. The smell of roasting meat mingles with that of burning oak. Tapestries sway slightly from the draughts, absorbing warmth that barely lasts. Servants hurry to fetch logs, each one heavier than a child, stacking them carefully to keep the blaze steady. The crackle of wood, the hiss of sap, the steady rhythm of flame against stone, it must have sounded like the heartbeat of the household itself. One charming detail recorded in a 15th century English household account describes how families threw fragrant herbs into the fire before sleep. Rosemary, sage, and juniper were believed to purify the air and chase away illness. You can almost smell it now, the brief sweetness that blooms before the smoke returns. Perhaps it was partly ritual, partly comfort, but it gave a sense of control over the unseen dangers of the night. There is still a quiet question among researchers about how people balanced the need for warmth with the constant threat of fire. Medieval homes were built largely of timber and straw, a dangerous combination. Fires could destroy entire villages in a single gust. Yet without flame, there was only freezing darkness. That tension between survival and destruction defined every household decision. The sound of the fire now fills the silence. It crackles softly, a conversation of sparks. You stretch your hands toward it, palms open, feeling the sharp sting as circulation returns. The warmth spreads through your arms, and for a brief moment, you understand why fire was so deeply revered. It was not just heat, it was life itself, unpredictable and wild, but essential. You think of the thousands of nameless people who tended such fires every night, crouched in smoky rooms, watching light dance on stone. The world outside was locked in ice, but here, at the edge of the hearth, there was motion, sound, and color. The flame was a companion that demanded constant attention, but gave in return a fragile promise. Live through the night, and morning will come. You feed it one last stick and step back, the orange glow warming your face. The smoke swirls upward, catching in the faint beam of dawn light that spills through the shutter. The room is no longer just a shelter. It is a world contained by flame and frost. You close your eyes and listen to the low, steady hum of burning wood, a sound that has soothed humanity for centuries. You step into a different world now, one defined by the soft rustle of straw and the muffled luxury of down. The way people slept in the Middle Ages told you everything about who they were. It was a silent language of comfort and class, woven from fabric, feathers, and necessity. In a single night, two different Europes existed side by side. The poor slept close to the floor, while the wealthy dreamed high above it, cocooned in silk and fur. Evidence from surviving household inventories reveals that beds were among the most valued possessions of the wealthy. A nobleman's bed could cost more than a farmer's cottage. Wooden frames were carved with symbols of status, and the mattresses were filled not with straw but with feathers from geese, ducks, or even swans. You picture the slow process of making such a bed: servants sewing linen casings, filling them carefully, then beating them until the feathers fluffed evenly. The result must have felt like sleeping on clouds, though even clouds grew cold in a stone castle. You lower yourself onto one of those imagined feather mattresses. The sensation is strange, soft but slightly uneven, the feathers shifting beneath your weight. The sheets smell faintly of lavender and beeswax, hints of wealth and cleanliness. Above you, a canopy of heavy fabric hangs like a tent, trapping the body heat of whoever sleeps beneath it. It is more than decoration. It is insulation. Curtains on all sides can be drawn tight to hold warmth, turning the bed into a small, private chamber within the room. According to several accounts by travelers of the time, these canopied beds often became the warmest places in an entire household. Servants or even guests sometimes slept at the foot of a master's bed to share the heat. The bed was not only for rest, but also a social symbol, a display of comfort and power. To own one like this meant control over the cold, something most people could never claim. Down in the village, the sound of sleep is different. You lie back on a straw mattress again, feeling the scratch and crunch of the stalks through a rough sheet. The poor called it a palliasse, and if you were lucky, it was replaced once or twice a year. In truth, many peasants simply shook it out, removed pests by hand, and reused the straw until it crumbled. The smell of earth and sweat lingered, but it was better than nothing. Archaeological digs in medieval villages have revealed straw-filled mattresses preserved by time and fire. Some even contained herbs like pennyroyal and mint, mixed with the straw to discourage fleas. It is a small touch of ingenuity, one that speaks to the human instinct to make do with whatever nature provides. You can almost smell it, the faint sweetness of crushed leaves under the weight of a tired body. There remains disagreement among historians about whether feather beds were truly comfortable or more symbolic than practical. Some argue that they flattened quickly, leaving lumps and uneven patches, while others believe they were genuinely luxurious compared to the alternatives. What is certain is that maintaining one required both money and labor. Feathers had to be cleaned, fluffed, and replaced regularly. It was not a bed you simply made and forgot. A curious mention in a 14th century English will describes a woman leaving her best feather bed to her eldest daughter, along with its pillows, blankets, and curtains. Beds were heirlooms, treasures to be passed down, not mere furniture. Owning one was like owning warmth itself. In a world where most slept in shared quarters or even beside livestock, such private comfort bordered on the divine. You imagine the sound of the two worlds together, the faint creak of a noble's bed frame echoing in a quiet chamber, and the rustle of straw shifting beneath a peasant family a mile away. Both sounds are gentle, steady, a kind of nightly music of survival. No matter the softness of feathers or the scratch of hay, the rhythm of sleep unites them. A lesser-known custom among the poor involved sleeping with their heads slightly elevated, resting against rolled-up clothing or sacks, not pillows. It was thought to help with breathing in smoky rooms. In contrast, the wealthy used embroidered cushions filled with feathers, sometimes perfumed. The difference was not only comfort, but sent the smell of clean linen versus the smell of life. Most researchers agree that this contrast between straw and feather reflected more than wealth. It reflected the entire structure of society. The materials you lay upon at night were reminders of your place in the world. Yet for both rich and poor, the purpose was the same: to find warmth, to rest, to endure another dawn. One curious superstition noted in medieval household records warned against shaking a bed after sunset, as it might disturb wandering spirits. Whether peasant or lord, people carried their fears into the dark. The bed was both a refuge and a place where dreams touched the unknown. Perhaps that is why even the finest feather mattresses could not entirely dispel the chill of the night. You lie back once more, imagining yourself on both beds at once, the peasant's straw crackling beneath you, the noble's feathers cradling your body. Two textures, two worlds, joined by one shared breath in the freezing dark. The fire flickers low, casting the same warm glow on both faces, rich and poor alike. Sleep, in the end, is the great equalizer, and the cold is its constant companion. Outside, frost thickens on the ground, sparkling faintly under the moonlight. Inside, the beds creak, the straw sighs, and for a few hours, the medieval world forgets its hunger, its hardship, its endless winter. Everyone sleeps, each in their own way, wrapped in whatever comfort they can claim. The night deepens again, and you find yourself dressing for bed in a way that feels more like preparing for a journey than for rest. In the medieval winter, sleeping was not a simple act of closing your eyes, but a battle plan. You begin with your shift, the long linen garment that serves as both underwear and nightclothes. The fabric feels cool at first, then slowly warms as it clings to your skin. It smells faintly of lye soap and smoke, proof of hard washing and hard living. Most written descriptions from the period agree that few people slept unclothed, even the rich. To do so would have seemed indecent and foolishly risky in the cold. Instead, they layered themselves as though preparing for a frostbitten campaign. Men pulled on woolen hose and long shirts, women wore chemises and petticoats. Both often added extra tunics or shawls before settling into bed. Warmth, not modesty, was the guiding rule. You wrap a cloak around your shoulders and sit near the fire, feeling its heat seep into the cloth. When you finally crawl into bed, you keep the cloak on, folding it over yourself. The layers press down gently, a comforting weight. Your nightcap slips slightly over your ears, and you adjust it, tucking the fabric beneath your chin. The cap may look comical to modern eyes, but it was essential. Without it, heat would escape through your head, and your dreams would be filled with shivers. Archaeological findings of medieval textiles show how practical people were about fabric. Wool was everywhere, spun coarse for peasants and fine for nobles. It held warmth even when damp and could be rewoven countless times. Linen, though more expensive, offered softness against the skin. Silk, when available, was for the privileged few and often used only in linings. Every stitch carried a purpose. In one surviving inventory from a 15th century merchant's household, the list of bedding and nightwear reads like armor against the cold. One woolen gown for night, one pair of hose for sleeping, one coif for the head, one pair of gloves for the frost. You can almost picture the scene, a weary man layering himself with quiet precision before extinguishing the candle. Each item a small act of protection. There remains debate among clothing historians about how much layering truly helped. Some argue that too many garments trapped moisture, which then chilled the body. Others suggest the combination of wool and linen created the perfect balance, insulating while still breathable. Whatever the truth, the people of the Middle Ages had centuries of trial and error to refine their bedtime ritual. You suspect they knew what worked long before any scholar could measure it. A charming detail mentioned in several chronicles notes that even servants often slept with socks or foot coverings made from scraps of old clothing. The poor sometimes wrapped their feet in rags or even parchment coated in fat to repel moisture. The wealthy had knitted hose or felt slippers lined with fur. You glance down at your own feet, snug and warm in wool, and feel grateful for such simple ingenuity. One of the stranger customs described in a 14th century French account tells of men sleeping with belts or girdles still tied around their waists, believing it kept their organs from wandering in the cold. The idea makes you smile, but it reveals the blend of superstition and practicality that colored everyday life. They dressed not only to stay warm but to feel safe. There is a tenderness to this nightly preparation. Families would help one another tie laces, smooth sleeves, and adjust caps. In large households, maids might assist their ladies in layering and tucking bedclothes, while children waited beside the fire for their turn. You can hear the quiet laughter, the soft exchange of words, the rhythm of fabric and hands. These were moments of warmth that belonged not to wealth, but to closeness. Most researchers agree that warmth in the Middle Ages depended on motion and material more than temperature itself. The more you wrapped yourself, the slower you moved, the more the heat stayed in. Yet it also required vigilance. Too much dampness, too much smoke, or a poorly aired blanket could invite sickness. People had to think about their beds as living systems. They were constantly tended, shaken, dried, and remade. A curious mention in a London Guild record describes tailors producing nightgowns of good weight, specifically for winter. These were not the elegant robes of mourning, but heavy, padded garments that could withstand long nights by the hearth or in a cold bed. You imagine one now, thick as armor yet soft enough to fold around the body, the stitching slightly uneven where a candle's light wavered during its making. You pull your blanket higher and feel the many textures against your skin: linen, wool, perhaps even fur at the edges. The layers form a little world of warmth around you. Outside, frost patterns the shutters, and a faint breeze slips through a crack in the wall. You tuck your chin lower, your breath making a small cave of mist beneath the covers. The world beyond the bed disappears, and you drift into the quiet rhythm of sleep. As the fire fades, you think of how much care went into this nightly ritual, how each thread, each fold, each garment carried the effort of survival. It was not elegance or vanity, but adaptation, perfected over generations. The medieval sleeper was not helpless against the cold. They were creative, disciplined, and deeply aware of what it took to make it through a frozen night. You turn once, twice, and then settle. The blanket sighs with you. Outside, the wind hums softly through the thatch. Inside, you are safe, warm, and wrapped in history. You wake again in the middle of the night, the air sharp enough to sting your nose. The fire has dimmed to a low red glow, and the shadows in the room have grown long and quiet. It is then you understand why people in the Middle Ages developed so many clever ways to keep warm before sleep. Fire alone was never enough. Warmth had to be coaxed, borrowed, and sometimes even shared with something living. Contemporary accounts from households both rich and poor describe a variety of small comforts designed to hold on to heat. One of the most common was the humble bed warmer, a shallow metal pan filled with hot coals, attached to a long wooden handle. Servants would slide it between the sheets a few minutes before their masters climbed in, careful not to scorch the linens. The smell of hot metal and singed fabric often lingered in the air, a mingling of danger and luxury. In simpler homes, the methods were more inventive. Heated stones wrapped in cloth served the same purpose, tucked near feet or under blankets. Sometimes the stones were taken directly from the hearth, still crackling with heat. When placed at the foot of the bed, they radiated a steady warmth that lasted just long enough to lull the sleeper into dreams. You pick one up now, feeling its rough surface pulsing with the last traces of fire, and place it gently beneath the covers. The bed seems to sigh with relief. Written descriptions from monastic inventories mention the use of hot water flasks made from thick leather bladders or small clay bottles. These were filled with water heated over the coals, tied tightly, and slipped into the bed. The design may sound familiar. It was the ancestor of the modern hot water bottle. Monks, who endured cold stone floors and drafty dormitories, depended on such small inventions to survive the long nights of prayer and silence. A particularly odd note from a 15th century household manual advises warming not just the bed, but also the air around it by burning aromatic herbs. Bay leaves, juniper, and rosemary were thought to gladden the spirits and cheer the body. You imagine the fragrance filling a small chamber, mixing with the smoke and flicker of candlelight. It must have felt briefly like stepping into spring. There is still no firm consensus among historians about how widely such luxuries were used. Some argue that heated bedpans were found only in noble households, while others point to archaeological finds suggesting they also appeared in prosperous townsfolk homes. Whatever their reach, the idea of chasing the cold away before sleep was universal. No one, peasant or lord, was free from winter's grasp. And then there were the warmers that had a heartbeat. Tiny lapdogs, especially the toy breeds favoured by noble women, often served as living sources of heat. Their small bodies radiated warmth that lasted through the night. The animals were even given small blankets or cushions near their mistress's feet. You can picture it, a lady in a grand canopy bed, smiling faintly as her dog curls into a ball beside her, both breathing in unison while frost creeps silently up the windows. In some regions, cats were given similar roles. though their independence made them less reliable bed companions. Rural folk often allowed them to roam freely at night, knowing that they would find the warmest spots on their own, often right in the middle of a sleeping body. The soft rumble of a cat's purr beside the fire might have been one of the few luxuries a peasant family enjoyed. An odd little piece of folklore from northern France mentions that keeping a dog or cat near your feet during winter sleep prevented evil dreams and the stealing of warmth by spirits. Whether believed literally or not, it gave people comfort. Warmth, after all, was more than physical. It was protection from the unseen. Most researchers today agree that medieval ingenuity with warmth reflects not just necessity but creativity. People adapted endlessly, turning household items into survival tools. A pot could be a stove, a cloak could be a blanket, and an animal could be a heater. It was a kind of quiet resilience born from centuries of endurance. You sit now beside a peasant hearth, watching a woman fill a small clay bottle with water. She tests it with her hand, then wraps it in a piece of wool and tucks it beside her baby. The infant stirs, sighs, and falls still again. The mother exhales in relief. Around her, the house hums with sleep. Even the cow in the adjoining stall seems to rest easier under the shared warmth of life. A traveller's account from the late 1300s tells of an inn where guests paid extra for a heated bed. The innkeeper's daughter would carry coals in a brass pan from room to room, leaving behind trails of light and the faint scent of smoke. You can imagine the anticipation of weary travellers, faces flushed from frost, watching her enter their room with that small promise of comfort. There is something deeply human about this ritual. The preparation for sleep becomes almost sacred, a choreography of warmth, care, and hope. The cold outside is relentless, but for a few hours, people carve out a pocket of gentleness in defiance. As you settle back into the warmth of your own bed, you think about how those same instincts survive today. We still tuck ourselves in, heat our rooms, and reach for something soft to hold against the chill. The difference is only in the tools. The longing for warmth, for safety, remains the same. The last glow from the hearth flickers once more before fading into the dark. You feel the weight of the blanket, the warmth of the stone beneath your feet, and the faint comfort of an imagined dog curled at your side. The wind whispers faintly outside, but it cannot touch you now. For tonight, you are safe inside this small circle of heat and history. The night feels heavier now, the air pressing down with the kind of cold that seeps through walls, through wool, through skin. You shift beneath your blanket, and for a moment you hear another person's breathing close beside you. It is soft and steady, the rhythm of someone deep in sleep. Then you remember where you are. In the medieval world, sleeping alone was rare. To share a bed was to share warmth, protection, and a little bit of life itself. According to letters and legal records from the period, bed sharing crossed nearly every social boundary. Servants often slept beside their masters, siblings with siblings, travellers with strangers. Beds were valuable, firewood expensive, and human heat the most reliable comfort of all. In a farmhouse, an entire family might sleep together on one straw mattress, limbs tangled, the air heavy with breath and the smell of wool. It was not considered strange or shameful. It was practical, and perhaps even comforting. You imagine yourself lying shoulder to shoulder with others, the closeness both awkward and familiar. The sound of breathing surrounds you, soft sighs and small movements. Someone turns over, the straw rustles, and a low murmur slips through the dark. There is a warmth that builds naturally, a cocoon made not of fabric but of people. The fire's faint glow lights the edges of faces, and for a moment, everyone looks peaceful. Chroniclers often described shared sleeping as ordinary life. A servant might spend years sleeping at the foot of a master's bed, rising with every command. Travellers at inns were frequently assigned shared spaces, strangers lined side by side. One 15th century innkeeper in York was even fined for allowing too many guests per bed, an early lesson in the limits of human tolerance. You smile at the image of tired travellers pretending not to notice the elbows or snores beside them. There is disagreement among modern historians about whether bed sharing was as constant as these accounts suggest. Some believe it was more common among the poor and in rural areas, while others argue it happened in all classes simply because heating was inefficient everywhere. But nearly everyone agrees that warmth was the central reason. To sleep alone in the cold was almost a luxury, and often a foolish one. A curious custom from Scottish households survives in old records describing box beds, wooden sleeping enclosures built directly into walls. Families could climb into these narrow compartments, close the shutters, and trap their collective heat inside. Children, parents, and sometimes even livestock shared the space. You picture the muffled sound of laughter, the mix of straw and wool, the faint smell of milk from the nearby cow. It was not comfort in our modern sense, but it was security. One traveller's diary from the 1300s recounts a night spent in a Breton cottage where the family insisted he share their bedding, lest the frost take his bones. He noted the strangeness of waking between strangers, yet also the quiet gratitude of surviving the night. It reveals something deeply human. When the cold becomes unbearable, closeness becomes kindness. In noble houses, the principle remained, even if the company changed. Married couples shared large curtained beds designed to hold heat and privacy. Servants sometimes slept nearby on pallets, ready to fetch firewood or water if called. Guests might share with hosts, an arrangement that blurred social lines but saved lives in bitter weather. The intimacy of proximity replaced the concept of personal space. An amusing little story recorded by an Italian monk tells of two scholars traveling together in winter who argued all night about theology while huddled under one blanket. Their debate grew so heated that they forgot their shivering. Perhaps that was the real secret to keeping warm: conversation, humor, and the distraction of thought. Researchers studying medieval sleep habits often note how this closeness shaped relationships. Bonds formed not just at the table or in prayer, but in the dark, when people whispered secrets or stories before drifting off. In those quiet hours, warmth was shared alongside trust. Fire's dim light created a small world where differences faded, and survival relied on companionship. You can almost feel that closeness now, the gentle rhythm of breaths blending, the shared silence punctuated by a cough or the crack of wood. There is something profoundly calming about it. The cold outside might rage and claw at the walls, but here, in this crowded space, life hums steadily. The heartbeat of one person becomes the lullaby of another. A curious note from a 14th century medical manuscript suggests that sharing a bed helped regulate body temperature and even calm the spirit. Physicians of the time believed that a body surrounded by other bodies balanced its humors more easily. It might sound strange now, but you sense the truth of it. The body finds peace in warmth, and the warmth of others is the oldest comfort there is. You shift slightly, feeling the weight of the blankets settle again. The air smells of smoke, straw, and something faintly sweet, perhaps from the herbs tucked into the bedding. Outside, the wind moans softly against the shutters. Inside, the quiet is full of life. Before you drift off again, you think about how modern sleep is solitary, controlled, and quiet. Yet here, in this medieval chamber, sleep feels communal, alive, and deeply human. The sharing of space becomes a sharing of survival. As you close your eyes, you imagine the warmth spreading slowly through the room, from one person to another, until everyone breathes in unison. The night holds its breath, the fire gives a small sigh, and for a few fleeting hours, the world outside ceases to exist. You rise before dawn to the sound of a low, melodic chanting. It echoes through the stone corridors, deep and hollow, as if the walls themselves are praying. The air bites your face the moment you move. You are no longer in a cottage or manor house, but in a monastery, a place where warmth was a privilege rarely spoken of, and sacrifice was woven into the fabric of daily life. Monastic life in the Middle Ages demanded discipline beyond imagination. The monks lived according to strict schedules, waking several times during the night to pray. These midnight vigils, called matins or nocturnes, were acts of devotion that often meant leaving a warm bed to face icy corridors and unheated chapels. Written records from abbeys across Europe describe how brothers slept in long dormitories lined with simple pallets of straw, each man wrapped in a coarse wool blanket and clothed in his habit even as he slept. You walk through one such dormitory now. The faint glow of oil lamps flickers against the walls, casting halos of trembling light. The smell is sharp, cold stone, old wool, and the smoke of tallow candles. The air hums with the sound of quiet breathing, broken by the soft scrape of sandals as one monk rises, then another, until the entire room stirs. There is no conversation, only movement. You can almost hear the rustle of robes as they pull their cowls over their heads and step into the freezing hall. According to the Benedictine rule, monks were to live without indulgence. Comfort was a danger to the soul. Their beds were wooden planks or simple frames with straw mattresses, their coverings plain and functional. They were forbidden to sleep too deeply or too long. To be half awake was to remain half in prayer. One chronicler noted that the cold was viewed as a test of faith, a reminder that earthly suffering brought one closer to divine endurance. The architecture itself offered little mercy. The thick walls that kept out wind also trapped dampness. Moisture crept into the air, seeping through clothing, clinging to skin. Monks sometimes complained of chilblains, aching joints, and frozen ink in their writing rooms. Yet few ever requested change. The discomfort was their chosen discipline. A surviving account from the Abbey of Cluny mentions that in severe winters, brothers would huddle near the cloister's brazier after matins, whispering prayers while warming their hands. The fire, small and tightly rationed, was as much a symbol as a source of heat. To stand beside it was a moment of grace, not a rite. You can almost see them, faces lit by orange glow, eyes half closed from exhaustion, yet peaceful in their stillness. There is disagreement among modern scholars about how strictly these ascetic rules were followed. Some abbeys, especially wealthier ones, may have allowed modest comfort, woolen blankets, small fires in certain rooms, or extra coverings for the elderly. Others held to poverty so fiercely that monks slept in near darkness, breathing air cold enough to frost their robes. The truth, as always, likely varied from place to place. One curious document from a Cistercian abbey describes monks wearing mittens to bed, stitched from scraps of wool. They called them sleeping gloves. Another account from northern England notes the practice of stuffing straw between two layers of linen to make a crude sleeping bag. These small details, preserved in monastic rules and inventories, reveal a quiet resilience behind the austerity. Faith may have guided them, but ingenuity kept them alive. It is easy to romanticize their devotion, but when you imagine the reality, you feel both admiration and awe. To wake in the dark, your breath turning to frost, to walk barefoot across frozen stones toward the chapel, and still find beauty in prayer, there is something timeless in that discipline. You can almost hear the chant rising in the distance, a low, rhythmic sound that mingles with the sigh of wind through the cloister arches. A peculiar tale told by later chroniclers recounts how some monks in northern France would warm their hands over the flame of a single candle while copying manuscripts. They joked that one candle was enough to heat both fingers and soul. It is a small human glimpse into a world of devotion built on endurance. Most researchers agree that monastic life, while harsh, offered a strange kind of peace. The absence of luxury freed the mind from distraction. The rhythm of prayer and labor created its own warmth, the warmth of purpose. To survive the cold was not merely to outlast it, but to transform it into contemplation. You walk with the monks now as they move through the cloister, their feet whispering against the stone floor. Outside, the courtyard is covered in frost. The moon hangs pale and still. The air is so clear that each breath feels sharp enough to cut. They form a line and enter the chapel, where rows of candles flicker weakly against the vast darkness. The sound of their chanting fills the air again, soft and deep, like the heartbeat of something ancient. As they bow their heads, you realize that even here, in this cold and silent world, there is warmth, the warmth of shared belief, of rhythm, of purpose. The cold may test the body, but it also purifies it. In the stillness, you feel your own breathing slow, your thoughts quiet. The chant fades, and the monks return to their beds, their movements practiced and calm. The dormitory fills again with the soft sound of rustling straw and gentle sighs. The fire has burned low, but the peace in the room is thick, almost tangible. The cold has not won. It never really does here. You lie down once more, pulling the blanket over yourself. The rough fabric scratches your cheek, and the smell of wool and smoke fills your nose. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls softly, marking the passing of another hour in this frozen monastery. You close your eyes and drift into sleep, feeling both the chill of stone and the quiet strength of faith. The morning sun creeps through a sliver of window, soft and pale, spilling light across carved wood and heavy drapery. You are in the bedchamber of a noble, and the difference is immediate. The air here smells of beeswax and polished oak rather than smoke and sweat. The fire in the hearth burns low but steady, fed by servants through the night. It is still cold, but a tolerable cold, one softened by luxury and design. Most written records from castles and manors describe noble bedrooms as miniature worlds of comfort. The bed was not just furniture, it was an entire private chamber. 4 tall posts rose from the frame, supporting a canopy of richly dyed fabric. Curtains hung from all sides, thick and lined, ready to be drawn closed. Within that enclosed space, warmth gathered like a secret. You can almost feel it as you part the curtains and step into the small cocoon of air, faintly warmer than the rest of the room. According to inventories and household accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries, a noble's bed might be piled with multiple mattresses, a straw base for support, a wool layer for insulation, and a feather-filled mattress for softness. Linen sheets covered the top, bleached white by sunlight or ash lye. Above them, embroidered blankets, velvet covers, and furs created a fortress of warmth. Each layer was both practical and decorative, a display of wealth hidden within intimacy. A curious note from a French castle inventory lists entire sets of bedding named for their owners. The king's great bed, the lady's red hangings, and the guest bed by the window. The fabrics themselves told stories. Deep reds symbolized power, while blues and greens were prized for their rarity. The dye came from distant lands, expensive and hard to maintain. Even asleep, the noble's body rested in color, texture, and status. There is still uncertainty among historians about how warm these canopied beds truly were. Some suggest that even with curtains drawn, drafts slipped through the floorboards and stone cracks. Others believe the enclosed design genuinely trapped heat, turning the bed into a personal climate. Whatever the truth, it represented a triumph of imagination against the cold. You can picture the flicker of a candle through the curtain, its golden glow casting long shadows on velvet folds. A delightful detail from a 15th century English letter describes a lady's bed as so well enclosed that the air within did keep my limbs from shivering. The writer goes on to mention that her maid had warmed her sheets with a brass pan filled with coals before she retired, leaving a faint scent of ash and iron. You can almost smell it now, the warmth of fire meeting the perfume of linen. The noble bedrooms were not silent. The crack of logs in the hearth, the soft flutter of fabric, and the Muted steps of servants filled the air. Sometimes a lapdog shifted at the foot of the bed, letting out a sigh. Other times, the wind outside howled, but it was only a distant sound, muffled by layers of cloth and stone. Within these walls, the night belonged to peace and ritual. It was common for nobles to sleep with companions, though not always for company. Ladies-in-waiting or chambermaids often rested nearby on pallets, ready to attend if the master or mistress stirred. Their presence ensured both safety and service. A bedchamber was never truly private. It was an extension of the social hierarchy, even in dreams. An unusual practice recorded in a few castle households involved perfuming the bed curtains with crushed herbs or rosewater before sleep. The process was meant to calm the mind and sweeten the air. You imagine the gentle fragrance drifting through the fabric, mixing with the warmth of bodies and the faint tang of burning wood. For a few moments, the winter world outside ceased to exist. Archaeological research on surviving bed frames from medieval estates shows grooves worn into the wood where curtains once slid back and forth. Each night, those heavy drapes were drawn shut, and the sleeper retreated into a small, dark enclosure like a cocoon of silence. Inside, time slowed. The world outside the curtain might be freezing, but inside, it was private and safe. A rare chronicler's note mentions that even royalty sometimes complained about the cold. King Henry VII reportedly slept with furs stacked so thickly that his servants joked he was buried in pelts. Despite wealth and architecture, the cold remained an equalizer. Yet the effort to defy it gave birth to elegance itself. The canopy bed, the layered sheets, the perfumed curtains, all were answers to the same eternal question: how to make winter bearable. Most scholars agree that the medieval bedchamber became the foundation of what later evolved into personal bedrooms in modern homes. Privacy, warmth, and decoration all began here. Before that, sleep was communal, shared, public. For the nobles, withdrawing behind the curtains was both comfort and statement, a symbol of control over the uncontrollable. You stand beside the bed now, watching the fire cast light across carved wood. The noble within stirs slightly, the fabric shifting like ripples in water. Outside, frost traces the windows, but inside, the room glows golden. The smell of linen and wax fills the air. You touch the curtain and feel its softness, the faint pulse of warmth behind it. As you step away, you realize that even surrounded by wealth, the same quiet truth remains. No one escaped the cold completely. They only learned to build small islands of comfort within it. The noble's bed, draped in velvet and guarded by servants, was not so different from the peasant's pile of straw. Both were sanctuaries in a frozen world. The fire crackles softly. Somewhere beyond the walls a bell tolls. The morning is close now, and the air carries the promise of another day's survival. Inside the canopy, someone sighs, turns, and drifts deeper into the warm heart of winter's longest night. You wake to a faint rattling sound. The wind is pressing against a window that never quite closes. The cold slips through every gap, swirling around the room like an invisible ghost. You sit up and see your breath bloom in the dim light, silver and soft. No matter how thick the walls, no matter how high the ceiling, the air of a medieval home was always alive with drafts. In many places, glass windows were a rare luxury. According to architectural records from the late Middle Ages, even wealthy households often relied on horn panes, oiled cloth, or wooden shutters to block the wind. Ordinary people had nothing but open holes that they covered with fabric, boards, or animal skins. You walk toward the window now and touch the frame. The wood feels rough, damp, and cold. A thin film of frost has formed on the inside. Outside, the snow reflects a weak morning light that glows like faded pewter. It is easy to forget how fragile the idea of a window once was. Transparent glass existed, but it was expensive and brittle. Only churches and royal manors could afford it regularly. When it did appear in private homes, it was small and thick, made by spinning molten glass into a roundel. You can picture it catching the light unevenly, bending the world into ripples of brightness and shadow. The beauty came with flaws, and those flaws let in the chill. Most surviving records of domestic architecture agree that windows were both blessing and curse. They let in light, but leaked warmth, like sieves. Curtains, shutters, and layers of cloth were the only defense. In castles, servants stuffed gaps with moss or tow, the fibrous waste of flax. In cottages, families used straw, rags, or even mud to seal cracks. You can imagine the faint smell of earth and smoke mixing as they pressed the material into place. A peculiar note from a 13th century building manual advises householders to hang heavy fabric over windows at night, lest the frost creep in. Those makeshift curtains were not for beauty but survival. In noble houses, they might be lined with velvet or fur. In poor cottages, they were old cloaks or grain sacks stitched together. You lift the curtain beside you now, and the rush of cold air against your hand feels like water. There remains disagreement among researchers about how much light people actually wanted indoors during winter. Some argue that windows were kept closed and covered for most of the season to conserve heat. Others believe that daylight, even dim and cold, was considered a blessing too precious to lose. In both cases, people had to balance warmth with vision, comfort with sanity. You can almost feel the tension in every draft that slides across your skin. An odd little custom mentioned in English household records describes people warming their window coverings near the hearth before hanging them at dusk. The heat stayed trapped for a short while, delaying the inevitable cold. The idea sounds charming and futile, yet somehow practical, the kind of small effort that defines daily survival. According to most medieval building evidence, cottages often had no glass at all. Instead, they used wooden shutters that were barred tight against the wind. During the day, these shutters opened upward to let smoke escape and sunlight in. At night, they were sealed, and the house sank into a dim cocoon of darkness. The scent of damp wood filled the air, and the sound of the storm became a lullaby. In northern Europe, some homes built tiny recessed alcoves beside windows, where a candle could sit protected from the draught. The soft glow turned frost crystals into glittering lace. You can imagine the quiet beauty of that sight, the world outside frozen, the world inside flickering with gold. For a moment, the cold becomes almost beautiful. A traveller's account from 1390 mentions spending a night in a manor where the window had no glass but was covered with parchment stretched tight. The firelight made the parchment glow like amber, and he wrote that it was as if I lay within a lantern. You picture that glow now, soft and soothing, the world outside blotted out entirely. Archaeological studies of surviving medieval homes show that many walls were thick enough to hold window seats. These small niches became resting spots during the day, though they were freezing at night. Children often sat there wrapped in furs, watching snow fall through distorted glass. The contrast between comfort and cold defined the medieval relationship with winter. It was always negotiation, never conquest. An amusing entry from a London chronicle tells of a merchant who bragged about owning 3 glass windows, only for one to shatter in a storm. The writer notes that the man wept as if his treasure were buried. Glass was precious not just for beauty but for pride. To own it meant you had defied the elements, at least a little. Most modern researchers agree that medieval architecture was ingenious in its simplicity. The thick walls, small openings, and layered fabrics reflected generations of adaptation. Yet nothing could fully stop the cold. The air you breathe now still tastes faintly metallic, the scent of frost carried from outside. You draw the curtain closed again and retreat to the warmth of the bed. The fabric muffles the world beyond, leaving you in soft shadow. The fire's light trembles on the wall, and for a moment you feel completely still. The draught still moves faintly, curling around your fingers like a ghost that refuses to leave. You tuck yourself deeper under the covers, listening to the faint whistle of wind through the cracks. This is what winter felt like in the Middle Ages. Not silence, but conversation. The house spoke in creaks, the windows sighed, and the wind answered. Cold and warmth were never separate. They danced together through every night. And even as you drift towards sleep, you feel that rhythm continuing, an endless give and take between comfort and the wild air beyond the walls. The night has settled deeply over the village, and you find yourself inside a small tavern, where the smell of warm ale, smoke, and damp wool fills the air. The chatter is low, gentle, more a murmur of survival than celebration. You sit beside a rough wooden table, hands wrapped around a steaming cup that glows faintly in the candlelight. In the Middle Ages, bedtime often began with drink, not for pleasure alone, but for warmth and safety. Most written accounts from medieval towns agree that water was rarely trusted. Wells froze or grew foul, streams filled with runoff, and sanitation was uncertain at best. To drink water could mean sickness. Beer and ale, however, were boiled during brewing and stored cleanly in barrels. They were safer and heartier, filled with calories to sustain tired bodies through long, frozen nights. You raise the cup and take a sip. The liquid is thick and slightly sour, comforting despite its roughness. According to tavern records and household guides, ale was often brewed weekly in homes, especially in winter. Each batch was cloudy, low in alcohol, and consumed quickly before it spoiled. The scent of yeast and grain-filled villages, drifting through doorways and mixing with smoke from chimneys. For many, it was the last warm thing they tasted before sleep. An interesting note from a London alewife's ledger lists ingredients not only for brewing but for night comfort: cloves, cinnamon, and honey added to ale and warmed by the fire. The result was what we might now call spiced beer or mulled ale, meant to soothe throats and fight chills. You can almost feel it slide down your throat now, leaving behind a slow, spreading heat that settles deep in your chest. There is debate among modern historians about how widely such spiced drinks were enjoyed. Some suggest they were luxuries reserved for merchants and nobles, while others argue that small quantities of spice were available even to lower classes during winter festivals. The truth likely lies somewhere between: a taste of warmth reserved for special nights, shared by all when fortune allowed. In noble houses, the evening drink might be wine instead of ale, often mulled with sugar, pepper, or nutmeg. Chronicles describe servants carrying cups of steaming wine to their masters' bedchambers as part of the nightly ritual. It was thought to promote restful sleep and ease the joints. Physicians of the time even recommended sweetened wine at the hour before retiring, to balance the body's humours. You can picture it: a lord reclining by the fire, cup in hand, the liquid glinting red in the candlelight while frost gathers outside his window. A curious habit from some monasteries involved drinking posset, a mixture of hot milk, ale, and herbs. It was used as a nightcap, a comfort, and sometimes as a medicine for sleeplessness. The texture was thick and strange, but monks swore by its ability to chase away the cold. One chronicler even joked that a warm posset calms both body and soul, and quiets the devil that dwelleth in empty stomachs. According to archaeological findings of medieval kitchenware, mugs and cups used for these drinks were often heavy and thick, made of clay or pewter to hold heat longer. You hold one in your hand now, feeling the warmth seep slowly through the cup, the rim rough against your lips. Around you, others do the same, each finding comfort in the same ritual. An amusing observation from a 14th century visitor to England noted that the English drink often, and yet they do not fall for the drink but for the cold. Perhaps he was right. In a world without central heating, the warmth of ale or wine was as necessary as the warmth of a fire. To drink was to survive. Most researchers agree that drinking before bed was more than indulgence. It was practical. The body relaxed, blood warmed, and sleep came easier. Even children were sometimes given watered-down ale or warm cider before lying down, a habit that blurred the line between nourishment and comfort. A charming household tip from a 15th century herbal manual suggests adding a pinch of ground ginger or a drop of honey to bedtime ale for pleasant dreams. Whether it worked or not, it gave the illusion of care, a small act of hope before the long, cold sleep. You sit quietly now, watching the tavern slowly empty. One by one, people finish their drinks, gather their cloaks, and step into the snow. The air outside bites, but their bellies glow with the warmth of malt and spice. The last embers in the hearth crackle softly, painting the walls in flickering amber light. You drink the final sip, the warmth lingering on your tongue. It is not just the heat that comforts you, but the ritual itself, the steady rhythm of life. Work, drink, prayer, rest. The tavern keeper wipes the tables, the fire sighs, and the wind hums faintly through the cracks in the door. As you step out into the night, the cold wraps around you instantly. Yet it feels softer now, gentler, as if the heat inside your chest has built its own small flame. You pull your cloak tighter and look up at the dark sky. The stars shimmer faintly, and somewhere in the distance, smoke curls upward from cottage chimneys. Everyone is retreating to their beds, their drinks still warming their dreams. In the stillness that follows, you realize that comfort is not found in excess but in small acts. A warm cup, a shared story, a moment of quiet before sleep. The night stretches wide, the earth frozen, and yet within it, humanity glows softly, like firelight in the snow. The wind outside howls like a restless spirit, but inside the barn it is warm, dim, and filled with the slow, steady sound of life. You are standing among animals now, their breath steaming in the cold air, their bodies radiating heat that seeps into your skin. It is not the luxury of velvet or fur that keeps this space warm, but the simplest and most ancient form of comfort, living warmth. Most rural families in the Middle Ages depended on their animals not only for food and labor, but also for survival through the coldest months. In many regions, the line between barn and home blurred entirely. According to village records from England and Scandinavia, cottages often included a byre or stable connected directly to the living quarters. The heat from cows, pigs, or goats drifted through thin partitions, warming the human space next door. It was practical, efficient, and surprisingly effective. You step closer to a cow, resting on a bed of straw, her eyes half closed, her massive body giving off a deep, steady warmth. The air smells of hay, milk, and the faint sourness of manure, but it is a living smell, full of presence. A child sleeps nearby, wrapped in a blanket, his head resting against his mother's arm. Behind them, a goat shifts in its pen and exhales softly. The family and their animals share the same breath, the same air, the same fragile shelter. A charming reference in a 14th century farming guide praises the gentle heat of the ox as the best gift of winter. The author recommended keeping livestock close during the darkest months, noting that their warmth doth bless the house as surely as fire. You can feel the truth of it in this space. Each animal is a small, steady furnace, turning hay and grain into heat that seeps into every corner of the room. There remains some disagreement among modern researchers about how intentional this practice was. Some argue that proximity to animals was simply the result of small building designs, not deliberate heating. Others believe it was a conscious choice, a kind of natural insulation that made sense in a world where wood was scarce. Whatever the reason, the outcome was the same, a warmth shared across species. One curious detail from a German village chronicle mentions that people often named their cows after saints during winter, as if to thank them for keeping death away. These animals were not just property but companions, their survival tied directly to the family's own. In return for their milk and labor, they offered warmth, the most precious gift of all when frost hardened the fields. You sit on a wooden stool, the straw rustling beneath you. A hen clucks softly in her sleep, and somewhere nearby, a cat curls up close to the fire pit, her fur rising and falling with each breath. The rhythm of animal life is comforting, constant. The air feels thick but alive, carrying the soft sound of chewing, shifting, breathing. It is not silence, but peace. In wealthier farmsteads, the layout was slightly different. According to archaeological findings, larger homes often had lofts or platforms above the barn section, allowing people to sleep above their animals. The heat rose upward, filling the sleeping space with a gentle, natural warmth. It was the earliest kind of central heating, powered not by machines, but by life itself. You imagine lying there, the wooden beams creaking faintly as cows move below, the scent of hay rising up like a lullaby. A rather amusing observation from a 15th century traveller in the Alps notes that peasants sleep beside their beasts and smell of them also, yet they laugh more heartily than the rich. Perhaps warmth and contentment are closer to joy than refinement. When you are not freezing, laughter comes easier. In some northern traditions, people even shared blankets with their smaller animals. Dogs, cats, and sometimes goats slept beside them, not as pets in the modern sense, but as allies. A curious folktale from Norway tells of a farmer who claimed his dog saved his life one winter by lying across his chest through the night. The story may have grown with time, but its heart is true. The bond between human and animal was forged as much in cold as in love. Most researchers agree that medieval people viewed warmth as a communal experience rather than a private one. Whether it came from family, animals, or shared firelight, heat belonged to everyone in the household. It was not divided but pooled, like water from a single well. To sleep near the creatures that fed you and carried your burdens was not humiliation. It was gratitude made practical. You lean back now and listen to the barn's music, the crackle of straw, the quiet sigh of cattle, the rhythmic sound of hooves shifting in rest. Above, the rafters creak softly in the wind. The air is heavy but kind, holding the scent of hay and the faint sweetness of milk. It feels timeless, almost holy. The line between home and stable disappears in this half-darkness. Life breathes together, warm and patient. Outside, snow falls silently, blanketing the fields in white. Inside, the glow of fire and flesh beats like a steady heart. You pull the blanket tighter around your shoulders, feel the heat of the cow beside you, and close your eyes. In this shared warmth, you understand something eternal. Comfort is not always elegance or solitude. Sometimes it is the sound of breathing in the dark, the weight of straw beneath you, and the presence of another life keeping the cold at bay. For all its hardship, this world knew how to find peace in the simplest things. The night settles again, slow and deep, the animals shift, the child sighs, and you feel your thoughts soften, your heart beats slow. Somewhere outside, the wind continues its song, but in here, it fades to nothing. Warmth fills the space between heartbeats, and sleep arrives quietly, like a promise kept. The night moves quietly through its middle hour, that strange pause between the first and second sleep. The fire in the hearth has faded to a soft, pulsing red, and a gentle glow spreads across the room. You open your eyes to find the world caught between waking and dreaming. For a moment you are unsure what time it is. The silence feels sacred, as though the universe itself is holding its breath. In the Middle Ages, this in-between time was familiar. People expected to wake after several hours of sleep, not in alarm, but in calm. They called it the watch or the waking, a time for reflection, prayer, or quiet tasks. Records from monastic routines, farmers' diaries, and even court documents confirm that this midnight stirring was part of life. You can picture villagers sitting up in bed, stretching their arms, whispering prayers, or tending embers that have begun to die. A passage from a 15th century English household manual suggests that waking in the middle of the night was healthy. It gave the body time to digest and the mind time to settle before the second rest. The rhythm of the human day followed the rhythm of the fire. Burn bright, fade, then rekindle. You stir the ashes with an iron rod and watch sparks rise into the dark, like stars escaping the earth. There is no rush in this quiet interval. People used it to check on livestock, nurse infants, or speak softly with family. Husbands and wives often used the time to share warmth and talk. Servants might step outside, wrapped in cloaks, to fetch more wood or look at the moonlight spreading across frozen ground. It was a peaceful hour, one that belonged entirely to the night. A delightful account from the writings of a French physician describes how patients were told to use this waking period for gentle movement. Walk to the fire, he advised. Sip warm drink, speak kindly, then return to slumber. You smile at the image of people shuffling through their rooms by candlelight, quiet and content, living in harmony with the rhythm of darkness. There is still some discussion among scholars about how conscious people were of this divided sleep pattern. Some argue it was instinctive, an adaptation to the long winter nights when the sun vanished early and dawn came late. Others believe it had spiritual roots, a balance between labor, prayer, and rest. Either way, the midnight pause was accepted as natural, even necessary. You imagine stepping outside during this time. The snow has stopped falling, and the village lies still beneath a silver moon. Smoke rises from chimneys in slow, thin streams, and the world seems wrapped in silence. The sound of your boots crunching through the snow feels loud, almost rude. Every window is dark except for one faint glimmer where someone else, like you, cannot sleep. The night belongs to both of you. In noble homes, the same rhythm unfolded with more ceremony. The master might rise for a sip of spiced wine or to say a few quiet prayers. Servants, half asleep on their pallets, might rise to stir the fire or check the doors. One record from a castle household mentions that guards were instructed to walk their rounds precisely during the middle watch, for men sleep deeply in the hours after. It was both practical and poetic, a time when the world turned gently in its dreams. A peculiar detail from a medieval herbal guide mentions that people kept certain plants by their beds during this hour to protect their dreams. Dill for peace, valerian for rest, rosemary for courage. The smell of crushed herbs must have filled the small rooms as people shifted in their sleep. You can almost sense it now, the mingling scent of smoke and green things, of warmth and wildness. Most researchers agree that this break between sleeps offered something modern life has mostly lost, a conversation with the night itself. Without clocks or electric lights, people's bodies followed the rhythm of firelight and darkness. They did not fight the waking but accepted it, using it as a quiet bridge between yesterday and tomorrow. An amusing entry in an old parish record notes that one farmer used the time to write small poems by the hearth, scratching lines into the margins of his account book. The cows sleep, the coals sigh, and my heart is warm, he wrote in one surviving verse. His handwriting is shaky, but his contentment feels timeless. As you sit there beside your own fire, the glow reflects softly on your hands. The sound of the wind outside is faint but steady. Somewhere nearby, someone coughs softly in their sleep, then turns over. You stare into the embers and watch them breathe, shrinking and flaring, like living hearts. This is the moment when thought feels clearer, when dreams still cling faintly to the edge of waking. People of the Middle Ages did not rush through it. They sat with it, let it settle around them like another kind of warmth. The night was not just emptiness, but time to think, to feel, to be. You lie back down, pulling the blanket to your chin. The straw shifts beneath you. The air smells faintly of ash, and your body finds the rhythm again. The heart slows. The breath deepens. You understand why they called it the second sleep. Not a new rest, but a return. Outside, frost coats the world in silence. Inside, your eyelids grow heavy, and you drift once more into the soft arms of the dark. The fire gives one last sigh, a small whisper of orange fading to grey. The watch is over, and the night resumes its ancient rhythm. You wake again before dawn, your body caught somewhere between dream and memory. The fire has gone out completely now, leaving only the faint smell of ash and smoke in the air. The room is silent except for the slow, steady breathing of others. It is during this stillness that dreams linger longest, half-formed shapes that fade only when the first hint of light appears. In the Middle Ages, this fragile border between sleep and waking was a world filled with mystery, fear, and faith. Medieval people believed that dreams carried meaning. They were not random flickers of the mind, but messages, warnings, or glimpses from another realm. Records from physicians, priests, and poets alike show how deeply the night world fascinated them. A dream could be sent by God or by something darker. People prayed before bed not only for rest, but for protection from troubling visions. You whisper a short prayer yourself now, as they once did. Let no evil visit my sleep. According to written collections of dream lore, such as the medieval dream books, interpretations were both detailed and imaginative. To dream of water meant change. To dream of fire meant danger or passion. To dream of warmth signified God's favor, while ice and snow foretold hardship or loss. You can imagine a villager waking shivering after such a dream, staring at the grey light of morning and wondering what fate had whispered in the dark. A curious practice mentioned in a 13th century clerical manual describes people placing small religious tokens or written prayers beneath their pillows to guard against nightmares. These tokens might be bits of parchment inscribed with psalms, or even tiny crosses carved from wood. The sound of one sliding beneath your head would be faint, almost comforting. There is still debate among historians about how much of this belief came from Christianity and how much from older pagan customs that survived quietly in rural life. Some scholars argue that the fear of dreams as spiritual visitations came from the Church's efforts to control superstition, while others see it as a natural extension of how medieval people viewed the invisible world. In a time without artificial light, darkness itself was sacred and alive. You remember how easily the mind plays tricks when it is cold and hungry. Many people went to sleep underfed, exhausted, or ill. The boundary between real and unreal was thin. One chronicler in the 14th century wrote of the fever of dreams that came during the hardest winters, when hunger and cold conspired to blur the senses. Some saw angels, others saw demons. A scholar writing centuries later suggested that lack of warmth and nourishment may have caused hallucinations mistaken for visions. Yet for those who experienced them, they were utterly real. A peculiar note in a monastic record tells of a brother who woke screaming one winter night, claiming he had seen the devil blowing frost through the cracks in the dormitory wall. The abbot later wrote that it was only a dream brought on by cold and exhaustion. Still, the story spread through the monastery, whispered each year when the frost returned. The line between faith and fear was always narrow. Most researchers today believe that the long, unbroken nights of winter intensified medieval dreaming. Without the glow of lamps or the noise of machines, the mind wandered freely. People lived closer to darkness, and in that darkness, imagination flourished. They accepted dreams as part of life, neither entirely feared nor entirely trusted. One of the more charming fragments of dream folklore from Italy says that if you dreamed of eating warm bread, it meant you would soon receive kindness. Another, from northern France, warned that if you dreamed of a frozen hearth, someone you loved might be ill. These beliefs gave shape to the unknowable, turning the vast silence of night into a conversation. You roll over on the straw mattress and close your eyes again. The faint hum of the wind outside sounds almost like a voice. Perhaps that is why people once thought dreams were carried by the air, entering through the breath as one slept. There is something poetic in that idea, that the night itself speaks to you while the world sleeps. A charming but eerie tale from a Breton village describes how, on the coldest nights, People believed their dreams could wander away from their bodies. They would wake feeling weak, certain that their souls had traveled somewhere in the dark. Families sometimes left candles burning near the bed to guide these wandering dreams home. The flickering light must have been a comfort in those long, fearful hours. It is easy to imagine the mixture of wonder and dread that filled those medieval nights. Without the insulation of modern walls, every sound and shadow became part of the dreamscape. The moan of wind through the chimney, the scratch of rats in the straw, the hiss of snow against shutters, all of it blurred into the texture of dreams. You can almost feel it now, the fragile veil between sleep and waking, between warmth and cold, between fear and faith. You breathe slowly, watching the faint mist of your breath rise into the air. The darkness around you is deep, but not unfriendly. Somewhere, someone murmurs in their sleep. Perhaps they are speaking to a vision, perhaps only to themselves. In the end, you realize that dreams were the one place where everyone in the Middle Ages could be equal. Peasant or noble, monk or queen, all closed their eyes and entered the same uncertain world. Their visions were born from the same darkness, their fears from the same cold. And when morning came, they all woke the same way, reaching instinctively for the warmth of the fire, the sound of a familiar voice, the comfort of knowing they had survived another night. The horizon outside begins to pale slightly, a hint of dawn brushing against the edges of the window. The dreams fade with it, leaving only the soft ache of memory. You close your eyes once more, not to sleep, but to listen to the silence, to the breath of the sleeping world, to the gentle promise that light is coming. The morning rises slowly, a dull silver light creeping across rooftops and frozen fields. The frost has settled thick on the ground, glinting faintly like powdered glass. You step outside and feel how the air changes between the countryside and the narrow lanes of a medieval town. The cold is the same everywhere, yet it behaves differently depending on where you stand. In the village, it smells of soil and wood smoke. In the city, it carries the sharp tang of stone, refuse, and coal dust. Most surviving descriptions from the period show that winter felt harsher in towns. The buildings trapped wind in narrow alleys, turning every street into a corridor of drafts. Stone walls absorbed the chill during the night and released it slowly during the day, keeping everything perpetually cold. The countryside, by contrast, had open space and more direct light. The air moved freely. It was cleaner, even if it bit harder at dawn. According to household accounts from medieval London and Paris, urban homes struggled to retain warmth. Fires burned constantly, but chimneys were poorly built and often leaked smoke into the rooms. The smell of soot clung to everything: clothes, bedding, even hair. You can picture a family gathered in a single room, sitting close to the hearth, their faces lit orange while their backs shiver in the drafts. In the background, you might hear the rattle of carts on cobblestones and the faint barking of dogs. Archaeological studies of surviving rural cottages tell a different story. These homes were built of timber, daub, and thatch, materials that breathed rather than trapped moisture. They were smoky and dim but slightly warmer once a fire had been going for several hours. The walls were thick with earth and straw, and the floors were often covered in rushes. The scent of hay and hearth smoke mingled into something earthy and familiar. One curious note from a 14th century English traveller remarks that the countryman lies warmer though poorer, for his house is small and his fire is near. There is truth in those words. Space was the enemy of heat. A grand hall looked impressive, but its high ceilings swallowed warmth faster than servants could pile logs. A cottage, for all its roughness, could feel like a nest. There is still discussion among historians about which environment was truly harder in winter. Some argue that the countryside, with its isolation and lack of supplies, posed the greater danger. Others claim that the crowded filth of cities, where illness spread easily and coal smoke poisoned the air, was far worse. Either way, survival depended on adaptation, not wealth. A charming but revealing anecdote from a Flemish merchant's diary tells of his visits to rural inns during winter. He complained that the peasants sleep beside beasts, yet their rooms are kinder than the stone chambers of town. The warmth of straw and company outweighed the dignity of brick and mortar. You can almost hear his reluctant admiration beneath the complaint. In cities, winter nights brought other sounds. The creak of shutters, the cry of night watchmen, the distant toll of bells marking each hour. People slept lightly, their dreams broken by noise and the smell of smoke drifting through open flues. In villages, the same darkness was quieter but more alive with natural sound. Owls, the rustle of hay, the soft lowing of animals. The countryside spoke in whispers, the city in sighs. An interesting finding from preserved city bylaws notes that residents were forbidden to light certain fires at night for fear of starting house fires. As a result, many urban dwellers went to bed early, relying on layers and heavy bedding instead of heat. Rural families, on the other hand, could keep their hearths burning longer without fear of inspection. The glow of a farmstead at midnight must have been a small miracle against the endless dark. Most researchers agree that both environments shaped how people viewed comfort. In the city, warmth was a rare luxury purchased with fuel and labor. In the countryside, it was earned through constant tending of fire and animals. Yet both worlds shared the same rituals wrapping in wool, sleeping in groups, praying for dawn. A curious architectural practice in northern towns involved hanging thick tapestries not only for decoration but to block drafts from stone walls. These woven scenes of knights and saints served as both insulation and art. In smaller homes, the same principle survived in humbler form. Blankets hung across doorways, straw pressed against cracks. Every fibre mattered. You walk now through a medieval street, your breath fogging in the cold. A baker opens his shop, the warmth spilling into the lane. The smell of bread mixes with the odour of coal and ash. People move slowly, wrapped in cloaks, their feet crunching frost-covered mud. The city wakes reluctantly, as if unsure whether it wants to face another day of winter. Beyond the walls, the countryside glows faintly with dawn. Smoke curls upward from thatched roofs, and the frozen fields shimmer under the first light. Somewhere, a farmer cracks ice from a trough, his hands red with cold. He pauses, breathes into his palms, and smiles faintly. His world is rough, but real, grounded in the rhythm of earth and fire. It is easy to imagine the tension between the two worlds, the bustle of stone streets versus the stillness of open fields. Both endured the same cold, but in different languages. The city spoke in echoes and smoke, the countryside in silence and breath. You turn toward the horizon, where the sky begins to glow pale gold. The frost catches the light, and for a moment everything looks equal. City towers, village roofs, distant hills, all shimmer under the same frozen Sunday. The night's hardships fade slowly, and you realize that whether one slept among stone or straw, warmth was always the same fragile dream, chased anew with every dawn. The light outside fades once more, and you find yourself scratching lightly at your arm beneath the layers of wool. It is a small irritation, but one that refuses to leave. You lift your sleeve and notice a faint red mark, and then you remember something the medieval world knew all too well. The tiny creatures that shared every bed, every blanket, every piece of straw. In the Middle Ages, comfort was often an illusion. No matter how carefully you swept your floor or aired your bedding, life beneath the fabric continued. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs were part of the night, as constant as the cold itself. Written accounts from the period make no attempt to hide it. They speak of the crawling companions of rest, of mornings spent shaking blankets near the fire, and of the resigned acceptance that no one truly slept alone. Archaeological studies of medieval bedding have confirmed what those accounts suggested. Straw mattresses, reused year after year, became nests for insects and mites. Even the wealthy, with their feather beds and linen sheets, could not escape entirely. The warmth that made sleep possible also made perfect breeding grounds. You can almost feel the faint movement beneath the fabric now, the delicate rustle that would keep a tired body half awake. A household record from 15th century York lists one servant's duty as combing garments for small vermin each morn. It was not punishment but routine. Every family had its own way of coping, hanging blankets in sunlight, beating them against walls, or sprinkling herbs thought to drive pests away. The smell of lavender, mint, or wormwood often filled sleeping spaces, not for luxury but as defense. A curious entry in a Paris physician's notes from 1379 mentions an ointment made from vinegar, salt, and crushed garlic that was applied to the scalp to deter lice. You can almost imagine the sting of it, sharp and pungent, yet better than the constant itch. For all their hardship, people were inventive, finding comfort where none seemed possible. There is still disagreement among researchers about how widespread pest control actually was. Some argue that wealthier households managed better hygiene, while others point to records showing nobles complaining about the same crawling irritations as peasants. A 14th century duchess wrote despairingly that, "My linen walks at night, though I lie still." Her misery was no different from that of the poorest farmer. You picture a peasant family shaking out their bedding beside the hearth before sleep, the light from the fire catching bits of straw as they scatter. The mother hums softly, her movements practiced. She knows which herbs help, which parts of the bed to avoid touching. The smell of smoke clings to everything, mingling with the faint, bitter scent of herbs. In this ritual, there is both care and fatigue. An odd but well-documented practice involved hanging bedclothes outdoors in winter frost. People believed the cold air would kill what crept unseen. It probably helped a little, but mostly it hardened the fabric and filled it with the crisp scent of snow. You can picture the sight. Rows of stiff sheets fluttering weakly in the icy breeze like white flags of surrender to nature. Most modern researchers agree that the medieval tolerance for discomfort came from necessity. People accepted certain miseries as simply part of life. The human body, the house, even the bed were porous, open to the world around them. Insects, smoke and cold all moved freely between them. Survival was not about erasing these problems, but about enduring them with calm repetition. A rather humorous story written by an Italian monk tells of his frustration while visiting a monastery in winter. He complained that the lice kept vigil better than we, and that no prayer could chase them away. His dry humor has survived centuries, a reminder that even the devout were not spared. You pull your blanket tighter, the coarse wool rough against your skin. The itch fades for a moment as the warmth returns. The sound of the fire, the faint hiss of the wind outside, and the rustle of straw beneath you merge into a single rhythm. It is imperfect, but it is enough. That was the secret of medieval life. Enough was plenty. A rare archaeological discovery in northern France revealed a bed still filled with preserved straw. When examined under magnification, it contained traces of mint and tansy, herbs known for their strong scent. Whoever slept there had cared enough to make the effort. Even small gestures of comfort mattered, because they were acts of defiance against the endless cold and the small indignities that came with it. You imagine lying there, exhausted after a long day, knowing that the warmth of your own body will invite the very creatures you tried to avoid. Yet you sleep anyway, because the body cannot fight forever. You dream of cleaner air, of summer fields, of running water, and when you wake, you do what countless others did. Shake the sheets, whisper a small prayer, and face the day again. The flicker of firelight on the wall looks almost alive now. Shadows shift like tiny moving forms. The night hums softly with invisible life, just as it always did. You smile faintly at the thought that even in discomfort, there is something profoundly human about this endurance. The world was rough, but so were the people who survived it. You let your eyes close again. The air is heavy with the smell of herbs and smoke. The itch fades, replaced by the rhythm of breath and the quiet promise that morning will come, and with it, another chance to chase the small troubles away. The sound of distant bells carries through the cold morning air, soft but clear, like metal singing against the frost. You are walking through the corridors of a castle now, and the air here feels different. It is grand, echoing, yet colder than the small peasant cottages you left behind. The walls are thick and built for defense, not for warmth. Even kings and queens, wrapped in luxury, felt the same winter bite that touched every soul in their realm. According to household accounts and chronicles from royal courts, the cold was a constant complaint even among the highest ranks. In a letter from the court of King Henry II, a servant wrote that the frost creeps even to the king's bed, though the fire roars like a beast. Another noted that the queen wore gloves indoors during morning prayers. Nobility had status, but the weather respected no titles. You enter a great hall lined with tapestries, each one glowing softly in the light of the fire. The images of hunting scenes and saints flicker across the fabric, their colours dulled by smoke. The air near the hearth is warm, but a few steps away the chill returns. Even the massive fire, fed with oak logs that crack and pop, cannot conquer the stone. You can feel the temperature shift as you move, warmth and cold braided together in every breath. According to inventories of royal residences, entire teams of servants were assigned to keep fires burning through the night. Wood had to be carried up from lower courtyards, cut, stacked, and arranged precisely. In winter, this was nearly a military operation, yet the rooms still froze. The grand ceilings trapped heat far above, leaving the floor cold enough to numb the feet. Some noble families covered their floors with layers of woven rush mats, and sometimes even furs, in an attempt to insulate the space. An odd detail from a 14th century account of the French court describes courtiers warming their hands by holding polished brass plates that had been heated near the fire. These small, portable warmers gleamed like gold in the firelight. The servants who carried them were said to chase the chill like hunters, moving from one chamber to another. You picture it now, the faint clink of metal, the smell of oil and heat rising from it. There is still disagreement among historians about just how cold castles truly were. Some argue that the heavy masonry and small windows trapped enough warmth to make large rooms comfortable once the fires had burned for hours. Others insist that even the grandest chambers remained icy, especially in northern regions. Archaeological studies of hearth designs suggest that most of the heat escaped upward through vast chimneys, leaving the lower air frigid. A surviving letter from a servant of King Edward IV complains that his grace suffers chill in his bones, though wrapped in fur and fed by flame. You can almost hear the quiet frustration in the words. Even surrounded by splendor, the body still shivers. Inside the royal chambers, the bed became the true heart of warmth. A monarch's bed was more fortress than furniture. Carved posts, heavy curtains, and layers upon layers of blankets. Historians who have reconstructed these beds describe them as small, enclosed spaces, barely large enough for two, designed to hold heat rather than grandeur. When the curtains were drawn, the world disappeared, leaving only the muffled crackle of fire and the scent of fur and wax. A curious anecdote from the Burgundian court tells of courtiers competing to present the finest bed covers to their ruler during winter. One nobleman offered a blanket lined with ermine and sewn with tiny pearls, claiming it could ward off the wind like armor. The king accepted it graciously, but was later seen sitting by the hearth wrapped in a common wool cloak. Perhaps he knew that real warmth did not need to sparkle. Researchers studying castle remains have found soot marks high on ceilings and scorch marks near fireplaces, evidence of long-burning fires and desperate attempts to drive away the cold. They also found thick soot deposits on tapestries, showing how the effort to heat the room filled the air with smoke. The warmth came at a cost. To breathe in such chambers was to inhale the struggle itself. A peculiar custom among the wealthy involved sleeping with small fires burning in portable braziers beside the bed. These metal bowls of coal glowed faintly through the night, casting red light across the room. They provided comfort but also danger, as more than one noble family lost property to fire. Still, the risk seemed preferable to freezing. Despite their discomfort, the nobility often turned the hardship into ritual. The morning warming ceremony, for instance, was both necessity and performance. Servants brought hot water, heated clothes by the fire, and carried in steaming cups of wine or broth to their masters' chambers. The first sigh of warmth each day became a symbol of order restored, of human triumph over the night. You look around the castle again. The fire burns high, and the air smells faintly of pine resin and melted wax. The nobles gather near the flames, their laughter echoing softly. Yet even in their smiles, you see the same small movements, the rubbing of hands, the tucking of feet under robes, the instinctive turn toward the heat. No one escapes the season entirely. Most researchers agree that winter made all classes humble in their own way. The poor fought it with closeness, the rich with ceremony. Yet both learned to respect it. The cold was not an enemy to defeat, but a teacher to endure. In this balance of power, even kings bowed their heads. You step closer to the fire, feeling its glow on your face. The air beyond the flames still bites, but within this circle of light, there is life. You close your eyes and listen to the murmur of voices, the faint hiss of logs. Outside, the wind beats against the castle walls, relentless and eternal. Inside, a room full of warmth flickers, fragile but real, like the heart of winter itself. You leave the castle behind and walk into the countryside once again. The night has deepened, and the air feels heavy, almost solid. The stars are bright but cold, their light hard as ice. In the distance, a small cottage glows faintly, a single orange spark against the dark fields. You step closer, drawn by the promise of warmth, and find yourself outside the home of a peasant family enduring one of the longest nights of the year. Inside, the room is small, smoky, and still. A woman sits by the hearth, turning a stick in the ashes to coax one last flicker of flame. Her hands are red from the cold, her face shadowed by exhaustion. Two children sleep beside her, curled together under a thin blanket. The air smells of wood, earth, and faintly of hunger. This is what winter means for the poor. Not simply cold, but endurance measured hour by hour. According to parish records and medieval poorhouse accounts, winter was often the cruelest season for the lower classes. Work slowed, food ran short, and illness spread easily. Many cottages relied on stored grain and dried vegetables, but by late winter, supplies grew thin. The fire that once burned brightly in November became a memory by February. The poor learned to sleep more, to conserve energy, to let time itself pass slower. A record from a 14th century manor court tells of families gathering together in a single cottage to share heat when frost became unbearable. Entire households slept side by side, sometimes taking turns lying closest to the hearth. The idea of privacy meant nothing when survival demanded warmth. You can picture the scene now. Layers of worn blankets, a small ember glowing in the corner, the air filled with the rhythm of many quiet breaths. Archaeological evidence from rural settlements supports these accounts. Hearths in poorer homes were often small and poorly vented, which meant the rooms filled with smoke. The walls, made of mud and wattle, trapped dampness that never quite left. Yet people managed. They covered floors with straw, patched roofs with cloth or rushes, and sealed cracks with clay. The cold was not something to escape, but something to live alongside. One touching entry from a village priest's journal describes visiting a widow who had run out of firewood. He found her, sitting with her hands folded beneath her apron, her breath rising before her like spirit smoke. The image lingers. You can almost see her, still and quiet, waiting for morning, her faith the only warmth left. There remains debate among historians about how many peasants actually froze to death in harsh winters. Records of exact numbers are rare, partly because cold often worked slowly, through illness and hunger rather than sudden death. Some scholars believe that communities supported one another more than we might imagine, sharing resources and care. Others argue that survival was brutally individual, every family for itself. Both may be true. The evidence tells stories of generosity and despair side by side. A peculiar detail from 15th century Scottish accounts mentions families stuffing their clothes with straw during the coldest nights, creating makeshift insulation. The rustling sound must have been strange in the dark, but it kept life in the body. Children sometimes wore the same garments for weeks, their small shapes wrapped in patched fabric till they looked like bundles of rags. You can hear the faint crackle of the straw as they shift in their sleep. Most researchers agree that winter transformed the rhythm of poor households entirely. With work in the fields halted, nights became longer and quieter. People told stories, sang softly, or prayed. They found small joys in shared company, even as their stomachs ached. The darkness became both enemy and companion, a teacher of patience. An unusual folk belief from rural Germany warned that to complain too loudly about the cold would invite the Winter Mother, a spirit who stole warmth from those who cursed her. So people learned to endure silently, their resistance becoming almost ritual. Every sigh, every breath, was a quiet prayer for spring. You sit now beside the family's dying fire. The mother looks at you but does not speak. Her eyes are tired yet calm, filled with the wisdom of survival. She adjusts the blanket over her children, then leans closer to the faint glow of the hearth. You feel the warmth fade with each breath, but it is still warmth. It is still something. The cottage walls groan softly in the wind. The thatch above creaks, and snow slips down the roof in muffled heaps. The sound is strangely peaceful. You realize that for the poor, sleep was not just rest, it was refuge. Dreams were moments of escape, small islands of comfort floating above hunger and cold. In the faint light, you notice a loaf of bread resting near the fire, hard as stone. It will soften slightly in the morning when warmed. You imagine the family breaking it apart carefully, dipping it in broth, each piece measured and shared. Such small acts of care kept hope alive. As the fire dwindles to ash, the mother closes her eyes and pulls her children closer. The room darkens, but their shapes remain visible in the glow of the embers. You lie still, feeling the rough floor beneath you and the quiet strength that fills this fragile space. Outside, the cold wind sweeps across the fields, indifferent to those within. But inside this tiny home, life endures. The fire might die, the walls might tremble, but as long as someone breathes, warmth survives. You close your eyes, the scent of smoke and straw filling your senses, and for a moment, you understand the true courage of winter, not conquering the cold, but learning to live gently inside it. The night deepens again, and you feel it pressing against the walls, thick with silence. Only the faint pop of the fire breaks the stillness. In this quiet world, where every shadow carries weight, people of the Middle Ages turned to unseen protections. The body could be wrapped in wool, the bed layered in furs, but the soul needed its own shelter. This was the hour when charms were hung, prayers were whispered, and the invisible world was acknowledged with care. According to parish inventories and household records, nearly every home kept some form of blessing near the bed. A crucifix above the headboard was common, but so were smaller, humbler items. A dried sprig of rosemary tied with red thread, a scrap of parchment with a psalm written on it, or a small pouch of salt tucked beneath the pillow. These objects were meant to keep harm at bay, to quiet the fears that came with darkness. A surviving English charm from the 14th century begins softly. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, bless the bed that I lie on. It was recited before sleep, believed to drive away nightmares and wandering spirits. You can almost hear the gentle murmur of the words, spoken by firelight, repeated night after night, until the rhythm itself became comfort. One intriguing detail recorded by a travelling friar tells of villagers marking their doors and bedposts with chalk on cold winter nights. The letters were the initials of the Magi, written as a sign of blessing against illness and storm. The chalk marks would fade by spring, just as the frost did, but their presence each winter was a quiet act of faith. There is still uncertainty among scholars about how deeply these practices mixed Christian belief with older pagan traditions. Some suggest that the use of herbs and amulets came from pre-Christian rituals of nature worship. Others argue that the Church simply absorbed these customs, allowing people to express their fears in familiar ways. Whatever their origin, they reflected a universal truth. When darkness felt alive, people needed to feel protected. A curious passage from a 13th century herbal describes hanging garlic or rue near the bed to repel wicked dreams and unseen guests. The scent of such herbs must have been strong, sharp enough to cut through the smoke and damp. You picture the small bundle swaying slightly in the breeze from a drafty window, its fragrance mixing with the smell of ash. According to household letters from rural families, winter was the season when tales of spirits multiplied. The long nights fed imagination. People believed the dead could wander, or that sickness itself might take shape and slip beneath doors. To hang charms and whisper blessings was both protection and ritual. It gave the feeling of control when nature and chance felt overwhelming. A rather touching account survives from a noblewoman's diary, written in the late 1400s. She described her habit of touching the curtain around her bed 3 times before sleeping, each time saying the name of a saint. She wrote, "It makes my dreams quiet and the dark less close." That small, private motion feels timeless. Even today, people still seek comfort in gestures they barely understand but cannot abandon. An odd superstition from Germany advised never to leave shoes facing the bed at night, lest a spirit walk into them. In some regions, people turned their shoes upside down before sleeping, believing it confused whatever evil watched from outside. These habits may seem strange, yet they reveal how deeply the medieval mind wove meaning into every action. To them, warmth and faith were threads of the same fabric. Most researchers agree that the night was both physical and spiritual in medieval life. It held danger in equal measure to peace. Sleep was surrender, and people rarely surrendered without first invoking something greater than themselves. Whether that power was divine or rooted in folklore did not matter. The act of asking for protection was what calmed the heart. In the poorest homes, where even a candle was precious, families prayed aloud together before lying down. The sound of their voices filled the dark, soft and steady. "Keep us this night," they said, "from frost and fright." The rhyme carried through generations, whispered by mothers to children, by widows to themselves. You can almost hear it now, carried faintly through the smoke-filled air. A minor yet charming discovery by archaeologists in rural England revealed tiny crosses scratched into the plaster above beds in several cottages. Some were careful and symmetrical, others crude and hasty. The markings were made by ordinary people, likely with nothing more than a nail or knife point. They were small but powerful, silent witnesses of faith carved into the bones of the house itself. As you lie back now, the firelight flickering across the ceiling, you feel the weight of all those small protections surrounding you. The charms, the chalk, the whispered prayers, each one an offering against the great silence of winter. The cold may press close, but it cannot cross that invisible boundary of belief. Outside, the wind picks up again, tugging at shutters and doors. You watch the shadows shift across the wall and imagine them as ancient shapes, the same ones people once feared. Yet you also feel something else, the calm that comes from knowing those who came before you faced the same fears and found peace in their rituals. The fire gives a final sigh, sparks drifting upward like tiny souls seeking light. You breathe in the scent of herbs, of smoke, of earth, and close your eyes. The darkness no longer feels threatening. It feels deep and quiet, filled with the soft echoes of faith and the promise of dawn waiting patiently beyond the frost. The night has grown quiet again, and in the stillness you hear the faint crackle of a pot simmering near the hearth. The scent that rises is rich and strange, full of herbs, honey, and something sharp that tingles in your nose. It is not a meal but a remedy, one of the countless concoctions medieval people turned to when winter bit too hard. In a world where sickness lurked in every chill and the line between cold and death was thin, medicine and warmth were nearly the same thing. According to old household recipes and herbals, winter brought a kind of kitchen alchemy. Families mixed wine, vinegar, and spice to create drinks that healed as well as comforted. Honey, pepper, and cloves were popular additions, believed to open the chest and stir the blood. You lift a wooden spoon from the pot and watch the thick liquid slide off it slowly, glistening in the firelight. A single sip burns faintly on the tongue, warming you from the inside out. One of the most common of these home cures was posset, a mixture of milk curdled with ale or wine, then flavored with herbs. It was served steaming hot before bed to soothe the throat and steady the heart. The texture was lumpy, the taste sour-sweet, but for those who lived through freezing nights, it was a miracle in a cup. A diary from a London widow in the 1400s mentions, "I take posset nightly for my comfort, and sleep more gently thereby." You can almost see her now, sitting near the hearth with her blanket drawn close, her breath fogging the air above her cup. Some recipes were more ambitious. A nobleman's physician once recommended a brew of red wine, saffron, nutmeg, and ginger boiled together, calling it the fire of the stomach. Such a drink would have filled a room with sweet, spicy air, the fragrance almost enough to lift the spirits even before the first sip. In wealthier homes, apothecaries sold dried herbs and exotic spices brought from far ports, symbols of both medicine and luxury. There is still discussion among modern scholars about how effective these old remedies truly were. Some, like honey and garlic mixtures, have genuine antibacterial properties. Others, such as powdered pearls or crushed gemstones prescribed for chills, were more wishful than wise. But to the people who used them, belief itself could heal. The warmth of the cup, the comfort of ritual, the act of caring for oneself all held power. A curious entry from a Benedictine herbal describes how monks made warming draughts using sage, thyme, and a touch of strong ale. They called it spiritus comfortans, the spirit that comforts. It was shared in small cups among the brothers after long nights of prayer. The smell of the herbs filled the cold stone halls, mingling with candle wax and the faint sweetness of beeswax polish. You can imagine their quiet satisfaction, the brief escape from chill and fatigue. Even the poorest homes practiced their own forms of healing. Peasants used what they had: onion, vinegar, and fat boiled together for coughs, or mustard seeds mixed with flour and tied to the skin to draw the cold out. The methods may sound crude, but they worked often enough to endure through centuries. Healing in winter was always about heat keeping the blood moving, the breath steady, the body awake. An odd but fascinating custom in northern villages involved baking small healing cakes filled with herbs, sometimes shaped like crosses. They were eaten before bed to ward off sickness, especially when the frost lingered late into spring. The scent of baking must have carried through the dark, a small comfort that made illness seem just a little less inevitable. Archaeologists have found traces of dried herbs and spices in pottery shards near hearths, evidence that these rituals of warmth and medicine reached every class. Even when ingredients were scarce, people improvised. A traveller's note from the 1300s describes a shepherd who boiled pine needles and honey together to make a drink for the chest. He drank it each night beside his flock and swore it kept the death wind away. Most researchers agree that medieval medicine, however primitive it seems now, was deeply human. It combined faith, observation, and a fierce desire to live. Every recipe was a small victory against helplessness. Even when it failed, it gave hope, and that was sometimes the greatest cure of all. A charming but slightly grim superstition claimed that the body's heat was a gift from God and should never be wasted. People believed that to let oneself grow too cold was a kind of sin, a neglect of the divine spark. Perhaps that is why they clung so fiercely to their warming tonics, their herbal brews, their scented poultices. They were preserving not only their health but their souls. You ladle another spoonful from the pot, the steam curling upward like soft white ghosts. The smell fills the room sweet, bitter, and comforting all at once. Outside, the wind rattles the shutters, but in here the air hums with life. You take a sip, and the heat travels through you, gentle and slow. For a moment, you understand the peace these ancient remedies brought. The cup is empty now, but the warmth lingers. The body remembers. You stretch your hands toward the dying fire, feeling the pulse of life beneath your skin. Around you, others are asleep, their breath steady, their dreams untouched by fear. The night is still cold, but it no longer feels threatening. It feels like a living thing, quieted for a while by the soft strength of warmth and care. The winter sun sets early, and the world sinks again into cold shadow. As the light fades, a different kind of life stirs within the walls of the town. You follow the narrow streets toward the market square, where a few stalls remain open despite the chill. The air smells of smoke, roasted nuts, and damp wool. This is the winter market, a place not of plenty but of survival. Here, warmth itself is bought and sold. According to surviving town ledgers and guild records, markets in the Middle Ages changed rhythm with the seasons. Summer brought vegetables, fruit, and bright fabrics. Winter brought wood, wool, candles, and remedies for the cold. Merchants cried their goods under breath that steamed in the frozen air. Blankets from Flanders. Good wax burns clean. Iron pans for your hearths. The market was not merely trade, it was hope made visible in stalls and sacks. You walk between the vendors now, your boots slipping on the icy cobblestones. Every sound echoes, the clatter of pots, the creak of carts, the cough of a horse nearby. The wind snakes through the square, carrying bits of conversation, the rasp of saws cutting firewood, and the rhythmic knock of hammers on metal. A blacksmith works even in this cold, shaping nails and hinges to keep homes sealed against the frost. Sparks leap up like small stars, dying quickly in the bitter air. A merchant selling thick woolen cloths calls to you. His hands are red from the cold, and his voice cracks. He shows you rolls of grey and brown fabric, coarse but dense, spun by farmers' wives through endless winter evenings. According to guild regulations from this period, such fabric had to be tightly woven and full of natural oil to resist dampness. You touch it, feeling its rough strength. It smells faintly of sheep, a scent that carried comfort in every cottage. A curious detail from a 14th century account describes how candles became precious enough to count as trade goods. People bought them by the dozen, storing them like treasure. A single tallow candle might burn for only a few hours, but that light meant safety. You can picture villagers huddled together at night, measuring their remaining candles as carefully as grain. The thought of darkness without flame must have been unbearable. There is some debate among economic historians about how accessible winter markets truly were to the poorest classes. Some argue that even peasants could buy small goods or barter what they made, while others believe these gatherings mostly served artisans and merchants. The truth likely shifted from town to town. Yet every record agrees that these markets were a lifeline, moments when people could gather, talk, and remember that they were not alone in the long season. An odd but charming entry in a merchant's journal describes selling bottles of comfort during a particularly harsh winter. These bottles contained spiced wine or ale sealed with wax, meant to be warmed by the hearth. The label promised cheer to the heart and warmth to the bones. You imagine the first sip of such a drink after walking miles through snow, how it must have felt like sunlight trapped in liquid. A traveller from the Low Countries once wrote that winter smells of wax and wool, of tar and fire. His words capture the essence of these markets perfectly. Everything here fights against the cold in some small way: candles to burn, oil to seal, fabrics to wrap, firewood to stack. Each object holds a little piece of warmth. Children weave between the stalls, laughing through clouds of misty breath. A woman sells baked chestnuts from a pan blackened by years of use. Their sweet scent drifts across the square, mingling with smoke from torches and the briny tang of salted fish. Even the poorest can afford one small indulgence, something to remind them that life has flavor even in frost. Most researchers agree that markets during the medieval winter served not just an economic purpose, but a social one. They broke the isolation of dark months. News was shared, stories told, marriages arranged, and prayers offered for the coming thaw. A single afternoon at the market could restore morale that no amount of firewood could. An unusual discovery in the remains of a 15th century marketplace revealed small coins, broken pins, and traces of wax pooled into the cracks of stone. The candles must have burned down where people stood talking, their hands cupped around the flame for warmth. You can almost see it, a circle of faces glowing in golden light, laughter rising into the freezing air. As evening falls, the stalls begin to close. Merchants pack their wares, carts creak away, and the square empties until only the echo of footsteps remains. The torches flicker in the wind, their smoke curling upward into the star-pierced sky. You linger a little longer, breathing in the scent of extinguished candles. When you finally turn toward home, the night feels softer. The market has done its work. You carry with you the quiet energy of human exchange, the warmth of trade, conversation, and shared endurance. The snow crunches under your feet, and somewhere behind you a single stall still burns a small torch, glowing faintly like a reminder that no darkness lasts forever. The wind is sharp again tonight, slicing through the trees as you approach another great fortress on a hill. Its stone towers rise pale against the moonlight, and the sound of the gale echoes through every archway. You step through the gate and into a corridor lined with tapestries, their heavy folds barely moving in the draught. The air smells of cold stone, damp wool, and smoke from a distant fire. Inside these walls, even wealth cannot silence the winter. Contemporary descriptions of castles often praised their strength, their size, their beauty. Few mentioned how cold they were. Accounts from the households of kings and lords describe constant complaints about freezing halls, dripping walls, and icy floors that numbed the feet. A castle might be the symbol of power, but to live inside it during January was an ordeal. You can feel the air now, thick and unmoving, cold enough that each breath seems to echo. Architectural evidence shows why. Castles were designed for defense, not comfort. Their walls were massive but uninsulated, their windows narrow slits made for archers, not light. Heat from the fires escaped upward through cavernous ceilings, while cold air seeped in through cracks in the stone. You walk through the great hall, its fire blazing high in a central hearth. Yet even here your fingers sting. Step away from the flames, and the cold swallows you again. According to royal building records, servants were tasked each day with scattering rushes across the floors to absorb moisture and dirt. These rushes were sometimes mixed with herbs like lavender or sweet flag to keep the smell fresh. They offered a little softness, but little warmth. At night, the chill from the floor crept upward, no matter how many furs covered the bed. A curious detail from the castle of Coucy in France mentions that icicles formed on the inside of the walls during one particularly severe winter. Chroniclers describe servants breaking them off each morning before lighting fires. You imagine the strange beauty of it: frozen crystals hanging like decorations in a noble hall, glittering in torchlight as people shivered beneath them. There is debate among modern historians about whether castles were truly uninhabitable in winter. Some argue that careful use of tapestries, fires, and bed hangings created pockets of comfort. Others believe that most rooms remain too cold for daily living, forcing residents to crowd near the kitchens or the Great Hall. Archaeological traces of soot high on ceilings and stone walls suggest that fires were kept burning constantly, their smoke leaving black memories behind. One intriguing record from a 15th century household ledger lists warming stools among the castle furnishings. These were wooden frames with compartments for hot coals, placed under garments or even beneath skirts. Ladies of the court sat upon them during long evenings, their gowns rising and falling with the heat. The practice was practical, though not without risk. There are stories of dresses smouldering from too much enthusiasm with the embers. A royal servant once described sleeping in a chamber where the frost gathered on his beard overnight. He wrote, "Even the breath of kings turns to snow when the wind comes through the stones." His words capture a strange humility that winter imposed on everyone. No matter how thick the curtains or how fine the fur, nature always found a way in. In wealthier castles, builders tried to fight back with ingenuity. They installed large fireplaces with carved hoods to direct heat into the room, and in later centuries, flues that could warm upper floors. Yet these were rare and inconsistent. In most cases, people survived by layering clothes, piling blankets, and huddling close together. The grand architecture became a kind of beautiful cage, echoing with the sound of footsteps on cold stone. An amusing entry from the account books of a northern lord mentions a payment to a carpenter for fixing a door that whistles in the wind. Even among the powerful, comfort required constant maintenance. Servants stuffed gaps with straw, hung furs along corridors, and even placed heated stones beneath tables to keep their masters' feet from freezing. You can almost hear the creak of those heavy doors as they strain against the storm outside. Most scholars agree that castles embodied the paradox of medieval winter, grandeur paired with discomfort. They were symbols of control, yet inside their thick walls, everyone still depended on the same small comforts: fire, cloth, and companionship. The richer the surroundings, the more dramatic the contrast between splendor and suffering. You walk deeper into the castle now, your footsteps echoing softly. A servant passes, arms full of firewood, his face red from the cold. Farther down the hall, a tapestry stirs slightly in the draught, revealing the grey stone behind it. The firelight glints on the metal fittings of a door, and for a moment you imagine the countless nights spent here. Nobles wrapped in furs, servants half asleep near the coals, the air filled with a low murmur of voices. Outside, the wind howls against the ramparts, scattering snow into the moat. Inside, the hearth burns steadily, defying the darkness. You feel both awe and sympathy for those who lived in such beauty and chill. Their lives, for all their wealth, still depended on the same fragile circle of warmth that peasants clung to miles away. You stand for a moment beside the fire, its glow trembling on your face. The air smells of oak smoke and wax. Beyond the walls, the winter continues without care for rank or riches. And inside, humanity endures, as it always has through light, through closeness, through the stubborn act of keeping the flame alive. The wind has quieted, and the world outside the window lies still under a blanket of white. Snow covers the roofs, the paths, the fields, muting every sound. You wake before the light fully breaks, and notice how strange the silence feels after a night of howling storms. The air inside the cottage is heavy and cold, yet peaceful, as if the world has paused to rest. You pull aside the curtain, and frost clings to the inside of the glass like lace. Each tiny crystal catches the faint light of dawn. The hearth beside you has gone dark, but a soft glow of ash hints at life still hidden beneath. You kneel and stir the embers carefully, breathing gently until the coals brighten again. The faint orange spreads, and warmth begins its slow return. According to early morning routines recorded in medieval household writings, rekindling the hearth was one of the first acts of the day. Before prayers, before food, before even speech, the fire had to live again. It was both habit and symbol, a renewal of life after the long uncertainty of night. You can imagine mothers, servants, and old men all performing the same ritual, their hands trembling in the cold, their breath forming little clouds that drift upward in the half-light. One diary from a merchant's wife in the 1400s describes waking to find frost inside her cup, the water frozen where she had left it the night before. She wrote of breaking the ice with her spoon and laughing quietly, saying, "The cold has manners enough to knock before it enters." Her humour feels human and bright against the greyness of the morning. Archaeological evidence from rural homes shows that people placed wide, shallow pans of water near their hearths, not just for cooking but to measure the cold. If the water froze solid overnight, they knew the day ahead would be bitter. It was a simple gauge of the season's power, a way to prepare for what waited beyond the door. A curious superstition from northern villages warned against sweeping ashes out before sunrise in winter. People believed that doing so would sweep away the house's warmth. Instead, ashes were left until daylight, when the new fire could reclaim them. You follow that wisdom now, letting the ashes stay where they are, soft and grey, the foundation for the next flame. Most researchers agree that morning routines in medieval winters were deliberate and unhurried. Speed wasted strength. People moved carefully, warming themselves by movement, by small tasks, by the rhythm of routine. In silence, they stacked wood, fetched water, and checked for leaks in the roof. In every gesture there was awareness of fragility. The cold was not something to escape, it was something to negotiate with respect. A record from a manor estate describes servants walking the corridors at dawn to clear icicles that formed along the edges of windows and inside door frames. They carried small cloths dipped in oil to wipe away the frost, trying to keep wood from splitting. You can almost hear the soft scraping sound, the steady repetition, the smell of oil and smoke. In poorer homes, mornings began with scraping frost-off bowls and spoons before breakfast. Bread was hard as stone, so people warmed it by holding it near the hearth, turning it slowly until the crust softened. The first meal was simple porridge, broth, or whatever remained from the night before, but its warmth felt like victory. Even a sip of something hot was a promise that life continued. An odd entry in a 14th century account from a northern abbey describes monks breaking ice inside the cloister fountain every morning with hammers. They recorded the sound as like bells for the Sunday. That image lingers in your mind, the clash of ice giving way to water, the return of motion and sound after stillness. There is still uncertainty among historians about how people's moods changed through these long winters. Some sources suggest deep melancholy, others describe laughter and community. Perhaps both were true. The same cold that made mornings difficult also made gatherings sweeter, fires brighter, and human closeness more cherished. You sit now beside the newly revived fire, feeling its warmth creep slowly into your bones. Outside, the sky brightens to pale silver. The snow on the roof begins to shift, making a soft creak as it settles. The world smells clean, almost sweet. The sound of a rooster drifts faintly from somewhere down the hill, marking another day survived. A traveller's journal from 1385 records the sound of snow falling from roofs at sunrise as the breath of the house. You listen now, and you understand why. The weight of the night releases itself in that small, quiet sound, and morning feels lighter because of it. As the light grows stronger, the cold loses its edge. The frost on the window begins to melt, water tracing slow lines down the glass. You sit still for a moment longer, your hands wrapped around a cup of warm broth. It tastes simple, salty, alive. The room glows faintly, and you can almost believe that spring, though far away, is already hiding somewhere beneath the snow. The fire crackles once more, and the first rays of sunlight reach the floor. The long night has passed again, as it always does. You breathe deeply, letting the air fill your lungs, heavy with the scent of smoke and renewal. In that breath, you feel what every medieval heart must have felt at dawn in winter: relief, gratitude, and quiet strength. The morning has come fully now, pale and hard-edged, the light of the winter sun falling thinly across the floor. You open your eyes and feel it before you see it, the sting of cold air biting at your face. The blanket has slipped away during the night, and your breath rises before you in small, cloudy bursts. You reach for the basin of water beside the bed and find that a skin of ice has formed across its surface. You break it with your fingertips, and the shock makes you gasp. This is how most people in the Middle Ages began their day in winter. Their first act, a reminder that comfort was fleeting and effort was everything. According to domestic guides and household letters from the period, mornings were a careful battle against the cold. People moved slowly, layering clothing piece by piece before daring to leave their beds. The heavy wool felt rough against the skin, but it brought life back to numb limbs. Servants, who rose before anyone else, performed these rituals in silence, their breath frosting as they crossed dark corridors to tend the fires. Their footsteps echoed softly, a rhythm as old as the season itself. A peasant's day began differently. The first light meant work, no matter how frozen the ground. Fields waited to be checked, animals fed, snow cleared from paths. A curious account from a 14th century farming record describes how men carried small embers in covered pots to light their outdoor fires, protecting the coals as if carrying the heart of the home itself. You can imagine the faint orange glow flickering inside the pot, like a secret against the grey sky. Most people tried to delay leaving their beds as long as possible. A letter from a merchant's wife in Bruges mentions that her husband lies long abed when frost is cruel, and curses the day that drags him forth. Yet even for the wealthy, idleness could not last. The duties of rank demanded presence. Meetings, prayers, or journeys awaited, and the cold became a test of dignity. An unusual detail recorded by an Italian physician describes noblemen rubbing their hands and faces with scented oil before rising, believing it sealed the pores against the chill. Whether or not it worked, the act itself created a small moment of ritual comfort. You picture them standing before low fires, their faces shining in the dim light, the air thick with the scent of rosemary and olive oil. In poorer homes, mornings were marked by movement. Parents roused children from straw beds, their voices low but firm. The youngest were often dressed while still half asleep, wrapped in whatever layers could be spared. The fire was coaxed back to life, and smoke filled the room again, settling in curls along the rafters. Breakfast was thin porridge or leftover broth, eaten with hands still trembling from the cold. It was not pleasure but necessity. Warmth turned into energy for another day. There remains discussion among historians about whether people in the Middle Ages dreaded the mornings more than the nights. Some argue that waking to the cold after a few hours of warmth was the hardest part of winter. Others believe that the early hours held a kind of quiet optimism, a reset of the daily struggle. Both might be true. Morning was hardship, but it was also proof of survival. A curious habit mentioned in monastic chronicles involved monks washing their faces in icy water as an act of humility and discipline. One abbot wrote that, "The body waketh the soul through cold." You can imagine the shock of it, the sharp bite of water against tired skin, the brief clarity it brings. For them, the cold was not punishment, but purification. For everyone else, it was simply routine. Hands were warmed over the fire, bread thawed, and chores resumed. Smoke from dozens of chimneys began to rise into the pale air, each one a quiet declaration that the world was awake again. The smell of burning wood drifted across villages and towns alike, a scent both comforting and constant. An odd but revealing practice found in English court records notes that many households refused to speak harshly before the morning fire was fully lit. It was thought that angry words could cool the hearth and bring bad fortune. The rule makes a strange kind of sense. In a world where warmth was fragile, even emotion had to be handled gently. Most researchers agree that the rhythm of medieval mornings was built on gratitude disguised as habit. Every task rekindling the fire, dressing in stiff clothes, breaking the ice in the basin was a quiet celebration of having another chance. The cold, though relentless, gave life a kind of sharpness. Every spark of heat, every sip of broth, every patch of sunlight on the floor felt earned. You stand now and stretch, the wool scratching faintly against your skin. The floor is cold beneath your feet, but the fire is burning again, and its glow climbs the walls like a slow sunrise. The first true light enters the room, pale gold reflecting off the frost on the window. The day ahead will be long and hard, but for now there is warmth, small but real. Outside, the snow crunches under footsteps. Somewhere a rooster crows, and a dog barks faintly in reply. The world stirs, shaking off the night stillness. You take one last look at the fire before stepping away, its embers breathing softly like the heart of the house. The morning chill will not vanish. It never does. But each day begins again with the same act of defiance, the same quiet courage to rise from the bed, to face the frost, and to keep moving. You breathe out slowly, watching your breath fade into the light. Another day has begun, and against all odds, it is warm enough to live. The days crawl by slowly now, each one short and pale, each night long and heavy. You can almost feel time itself thickening, the rhythm of life slowed by frost. People in the Middle Ages knew this feeling well. Winter was not only a season of cold, but a season of patience. When work in the fields stopped and travel became dangerous, the world turned inward. It was a time to mend, to tell stories, and to wait. In manor records and monastic calendars, these midwinter months are described with a kind of reverent slowness. Farmers repaired their tools, women spun thread, children helped twist cords or patch torn garments. Each small task was an answer to stillness. The hands stayed busy, even when the body longed to sleep. You sit now by the fire, watching a woman's fingers move deftly over wool, her face calm in the flicker of light. The air smells faintly of smoke, oil, and old fabric. According to household guides from the 15th century, spinning and weaving were the most common winter labors. The rhythmic motion of the spindle and wheel filled homes with quiet music, a low humming that soothed the dark hours. The sound of it must have been everywhere, soft, repetitive, endless. It was not only work but meditation, a way to mark time while the world slept outside. An entry from a medieval abbess's journal describes the satisfaction of such rhythm. The wheel turns, and with it, so do my thoughts. She wrote of finding peace in repetition, of letting the cold fade from her mind as thread became cloth. You can almost hear the wheel turning now, steady as a heartbeat. In the homes of peasants, winter chores carried a similar quiet purpose. People mended harnesses, carved handles, and patched roof leaks with tar and straw. Children gathered brushwood for kindling, their laughter echoing faintly in the frozen air. Inside, women tended pots that simmered all day over small fires, turning scraps of root and grain into thin but nourishing stews. The smell of onions and herbs filled every space, lingering long after the meal was gone. A curious record from a French household mentions making candles in midwinter when daylight was shortest. The process was messy but necessary, dipping wicks into melted tallow again and again until they thickened. The room must have smelled sharp and oily, but the result was gold light captured in wax. You can picture the family standing around the fire, each taking turns, their faces glowing with the faint sheen of warmth reflected from their work. There remains some disagreement among historians about how people managed the mental weight of these long, confined months. Some accounts speak of cheerfulness, of songs and stories that filled the dark hours. Others describe gloom, quarrels, and quiet despair. Both feelings must have existed, woven together like the threads of cloth that dried above every hearth. An amusing note from a 14th century Welsh parish mentions a villager fined for disturbing the peace of the winter evening with loud argument. The image is vivid: cramped rooms, too many bodies, tempers heated faster than the fire could burn. Yet another record from the same village describes gatherings of neighbors sharing ale and songs by candlelight. The mood shifted like weatherstorm and calm, laughter and silence. Most researchers agree that storytelling was as important as food in surviving the cold. Families passed long nights, sharing tales of saints, ghosts, and faraway lands. Some were cautionary, others simply comforting. The voice of a storyteller could fill a room better than any flame. You listen now as an old man begins his tale, his voice gravelly but warm, weaving old legends into the present moment. The children lean closer, their eyes bright. In noble houses, the rhythm was more refined but not so different. Musicians played soft tunes near the hearth, and readers recited romances or moral tales. The sound of harps and voices blended with the crackle of the fire. The wealthy may have had more candles and furs, but they too relied on stories to make the night feel smaller. An interesting find from a 15th century account book lists one boy for reading aloud among a noble household's servants. His task was simple: to read softly through the evening while others embroidered, wrote letters, or simply listened. The human voice was the warmth that touched everyone equally. In monasteries, winter evenings were filled with quiet work, copying texts, binding pages, preparing ink. A monk's note in the margin of an old manuscript reads, "It is too cold to write. My fingers are stiff as sticks." Yet he continued, line after line, word after word, the act itself a prayer. The faint scratch of quills echoed through halls heavy with silence. You sit still now, listening to the same imagined sounds: spinning wheels, distant songs, the low hum of human life resisting stillness. The fire before you burns low, its light a soft pulse that matches your heartbeat. The room smells of wax, wool, and slow-cooked food. Nothing moves quickly, but everything endures. Outside, frost glitters on branches like fine dust. The moonlight spreads pale and wide, touching every rooftop, every road. Inside, time stretches gently. You feel yourself slipping into that same rhythm of waiting, of quiet work and slow hope. It is not boredom, but peace, a steady breath against the endless cold. You look at the faces around you, half lit by fire, and realize what kept people alive through centuries of winters. Not strength alone, but rhythm. Not grandeur, but patience. The wheel turns, the story continues, and the world, no matter how cold, keeps moving forward. The wind outside has softened, but the chill remains. You rise slowly and step toward the window, where dawn paints a thin line of gold across the horizon. The world is still locked in frost, yet something feels different. The air smells faintly of damp earth rather than pure ice. Somewhere beneath the surface, the first signs of spring are beginning to stir. You can almost sense it, quiet but real. For people in the Middle Ages, this subtle change was cause for cautious hope. The hardest part of winter came not at its beginning but near its end, when supplies were nearly gone and strength was fading. This time was often called the hunger gap, the cold stretch between stored harvests and the first green shoots. Records from parish accounts and manorial rolls speak of dwindling grain stores, spoiled meat, and desperate foraging. Yet they also speak of endurance, of families holding out for the first thaw. You sit by the hearth, now reduced to a few glowing coals. The air inside the room feels lighter. The routine continues as always: stirring embers, adding wood, waiting for the slow build of warmth. A woman near you hums softly as she checks the last of her flour. The sound is almost like a prayer, a melody to keep hope steady. A chronicle from a 15th century English village describes this season as the cold of the stomach and the trembling of the bones. It tells of people boiling whatever they could find, nettles, leeks, or roots left from autumn. Yet it also notes the sudden joy when snow melted enough to reveal new grass. Sheep bleated with life again, and farmers whispered that the earth was waking. You imagine that moment now, the first drops of meltwater sliding down from the roof, the faint sound of dripping marking the slow return of life. Archaeological evidence from rural sites reveals storage pits dug deep into the ground, lined with straw to preserve food through the cold months. By late winter, these were nearly empty. Dried beans and salted fish might remain, but nothing fresh. Still, people found ways to stretch what they had, sharing within communities or bartering for what little others could spare. These acts of cooperation, quiet and unrecorded, carried as much weight as any grand feast. A curious detail from a monastery's kitchen log mentions the careful rationing of beer during these months. It reads, 2 cups daily, that the brothers may labour still. The liquid nourished more than the body. It lifted the spirit. In many homes, even children drank weak ale to stay strong. The familiar taste of grain and yeast must have been a comfort, a reminder of harvests past and harvests yet to come. There is still disagreement among historians about how severe these late winter hardships truly were. Some argue that famine was rare, except in times of crop failure or war. Others point to repeated entries in tax and tithe records describing hunger so common it needed no special mention. The truth perhaps lies in the space between. Survival was possible, but it was never easy. A touching passage from a Breton priest's diary captures the emotional rhythm of this season. He wrote, "The snow fades and the heart grows lighter, though the bowl is not yet full." Those words carry centuries of truth. Even with hunger, the sight of thawing ground was enough to make people believe again in the turning of the world. In noble houses, the season was gentler but still lean. The lavish stores of autumn had dwindled, and even rich kitchens turned to salted meats, dried fruits, and thick stews made to last. One steward's account lists a delivery of green herbs from the south, likely imported at great cost. The arrival of those small green leaves must have felt like a miracle amid the greyness. In monasteries, gardens began to stir early. Monks sheltered seedlings beneath straw or glass to coax life back into the soil. A chronicler from Westminster Abbey wrote that, "To see the first sprigs of parsley is to remember that God keeps time." You smile at the simplicity of that faith, the belief that growth itself was proof of grace. Most researchers agree that this late stage of winter shaped medieval resilience more than any other. People learned to wait, to measure days by change rather than abundance. The first birds returning from migration, the sound of water trickling through frozen ditches, even the sight of smoke rising thinner as wood burned cleaner, all of it meant renewal. A strange but endearing custom in parts of rural Germany involved hanging small wreaths of green ivy inside homes at the first thaw. Families called it the promise branch. It was left above the hearth until real leaves appeared outside. You can picture the moment. A mother hanging the small wreath, her children watching with tired eyes, the faint scent of sap filling the air. You step outside now, feeling the ground beneath your boots soften slightly. The snow still lies thick in places, but the edges have turned to slush. The wind carries a gentler sound, a whisper of water moving under ice. The cold still stings, but it feels less cruel, less endless. You look toward the horizon, where a thin mist rises from the fields. The light grows stronger, turning the world silver and then gold. For a moment, you think of all the winters before this one, all the people who waited through them, their hunger, their patience, their quiet faith in warmth's return. The fire inside the cottage begins to smoke again, its scent mingling with the faint smell of thawing soil. You breathe deeply, feeling both the chill and the promise in the air. The hardest part is nearly over. The earth is turning again, and with it every soul that has endured the long sleep of winter. The frost lingers only in patches now, scattered across shaded fields like the last breath of a long winter. The mornings still bite, but the light has changed. It falls softer through the windows, golden instead of grey. The air carries a scent you have almost forgotten: wet soil, wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of thawing grass. You step outside, and for the first time in months, you hear birds. Their song feels fragile, hesitant, as if the world itself is relearning how to speak. In the Middle Ages, this shift was more than a change of weather. It was a spiritual moment, a turning point marked by both gratitude and caution. People welcomed warmth as a gift, but knew it came with risk. The thaw brought mud, sickness, and flooding, yet also life. Records from village accounts describe both joy and labor beginning again. The spade is lifted, and the frost forgets its name, one farmer wrote. You can almost see him smiling, breathless from work yet alive in the returning Sunday. Inside the homes that survived the season, the air feels lighter. Blankets are aired outside, straw replaced, windows cracked open to let in what people called the good wind. The first true warmth, smells of smoke, sweat, and renewal. A woman shakes her bedding in the yard, the fabric snapping in the wind. The cold has not vanished, but it has lost its power. According to parish calendars, these weeks were filled with ritual cleaning: ashes swept from hearths, floors scrubbed, and walls wiped down to chase away the damp. It was both hygiene and prayer, a physical way of marking the end of hardship. In monastic life, this time aligned with Lent, a season of fasting and reflection that mirrored the natural return to simplicity. For peasants and nobles alike, it felt as though both body and earth were waking together. A curious entry in a 15th century English household guide recommends that, on the first warm day, open all windows and let the air strike through the house, that the spirits of the cold may flee. You picture the rush of wind through narrow halls, the flutter of curtains, and the deep breath that followed. Even if the idea of spirits was symbolic, the gesture carried meaning. Fresh air meant hope. There is still some disagreement among historians about how quickly people shifted from winter habits to spring routines. Some evidence suggests that the poorest had no real pause, their work never stopped, only changed shape. Others argue that late winter and early spring were marked by restlessness, a kind of physical and spiritual stirring. Everyone, regardless of class, felt the same impatience for warmth. A delightful but odd folk custom from southern France described villagers lighting small fires in their fields at dusk to call the sun closer. The smoke rising in the fading light must have looked like hundreds of candles offered to the sky. These rituals were ancient and deeply human expressions of gratitude, longing, and relief all at once. For the wealthy, this time meant movement. Kings and nobles began traveling again, inspecting lands or hosting feasts to celebrate the thaw. A steward's letter from Burgundy records the return of hawking, hunting, and long rides through woods still pale with frost. "The air is sharp but kind," he wrote, "and the horses breathe steam like spirits returning." You can imagine the energy in those outings, the laughter echoing through forests that had slept for months. In villages, the first market of spring was cause for celebration. Fresh eggs, early greens, and milk returned to the stalls. The sound of chatter and trade filled the air again. One chronicler described the scene as the earth smiling through mud. Farmers brought their animals from barns to graze, children splashed in thawed streams, and everyone spoke of planting. An odd note in a German farming manual advises patience: do not sow before the frost has kissed you twice. It warned that false springs could trick the unwary. The advice feels timeless, a reminder that nature always keeps its own schedule. Even as people rejoiced, they watched the sky carefully, ready for one last surprise of cold. Most researchers agree that the transition from winter to spring shaped medieval gratitude more than any sermon or festival. It was not abundance that moved them, but change itself. To see life return after months of silence was proof that endurance mattered. A chronicler from a small priory in Flanders captured it perfectly. "After the cold, all things taste of mercy." You walk now through a meadow where snow once lay thick. The ground is soft beneath your boots, and water trickles through small rivulets, bright as glass. The wind carries the scent of wood, smoke, and earth. Somewhere behind you, a bell rings faintly, marking the hour. It feels less like time passing, and more like the world exhaling. Inside the nearest cottage, the family sits by a smaller fire than before. The room is bright now, filled with morning light. The walls are no longer sweating with damp, and the air smells of bread baking. A child laughs, chasing a cat across the floor. These sounds, ordinary and small, carry the weight of miracles. The mother opens the door to shake the last of the ashes from the hearth. The smoke drifts upward and disappears into the clean air. She pauses, looks toward the sky, and smiles faintly. Her hands are cracked, her back bent, but her eyes hold the simple triumph of survival. You breathe in deeply, feeling the crispness of early spring fill your chest. The warmth is still gentle, easily lost, but it is there. The long, cold nights that shaped every dream are beginning to fade, replaced by something fragile yet unstoppable. You realize that this is how it always ends, not with sudden light, but with small, steady changes that no one can deny. The fire inside the cottage burns low, a soft echo of all the flames that carried humanity through centuries of winter. The air hums quietly, alive again. You close your eyes and feel the earth turning beneath you, slow and certain, carrying warmth back into the world one breath at a time. The air tonight feels different from all the nights before. It is softer, gentler, touched with the faintest promise of warmth. The snow has melted from the rooftops, leaving them dark and shining in the moonlight. Somewhere in the distance, a stream gurgles where ice once ruled. You sit beside a quiet fire, smaller now but steady, its light flickering across the walls like the heartbeat of the house. The season of endurance is ending. For people of the Middle Ages, this moment marked the renewal of faith and life itself. They had lived through the longest nights, and now the world was beginning to breathe again. Chroniclers called this time the breaking of the frost. It meant more than a change in temperature, it meant survival. Villages that had grown silent during winter filled again with movement and sound. Carts rolled over muddy roads, fields filled with laughter, and the smoke that rose from chimneys smelled less of desperation and more of life returning to its ordinary rhythm. Inside every home, the old winter routines slowly unwound. Furs were cleaned and stored, blankets shaken and hung in the Sunday. Windows were thrown open to let the stale air flee, and for the first time in months, warmth entered without effort. You can imagine a mother watching her children chase each other outside, smiling to herself as sunlight spills into the room. For her, spring is not an idea. It is proof that the cold can be conquered with patience. According to church calendars, this transition was marked by holy days that blended prayer with celebration. Candlemas, Lent, and eventually Easter all drew meaning from the same truth, the return of light. In sermons and songs, fire became a symbol not just of heat but of hope. Monks wrote hymns about the rebirth of the earth, while villagers made bonfires in the fields, tossing in straw and singing to thank the season that had finally released them. A letter from a noble household in Burgundy describes a feast held at the first thaw. The writer notes that the wine flowed freely, the servants sang, and the Lord himself laughed until tears froze on his beard. It was joy born of relief, not excess. Every loaf of bread, every cup raised, carried the quiet weight of survival. You picture the great hall glowing with torchlight, the echo of voices bouncing off stone, the scent of roasted meat and spilled ale filling the air. Outside, frost still glimmers faintly, but no one minds. In smaller homes, celebration took simpler forms. Peasants baked flat cakes to mark the end of winter, each decorated with a symbol of the Sunday. Families gathered near the fire and shared the last of their stored apples, their laughter soft but real. For them, the joy was not in feasting but in knowing there would be another harvest, another cycle of days and nights to endure. There is still discussion among historians about how people balanced faith and folklore during this renewal. Some claim that these festivals were remnants of older pagan rituals, transformed by Christian meaning. Others see them as purely practical, a community's way of acknowledging survival. Whatever their origin, they show that gratitude was as essential as food. People needed to thank something, even if only the turning sky. A charming detail from a 14th century French chronicle describes villagers decorating their doors with garlands of green twigs, calling it the greeting of spring. The branches were thought to invite warmth into the home and keep illness away. You can almost smell the freshness of those leaves, the sweetness of sap mingling with smoke from the last indoor fires. Most researchers agree that the first warm evenings after winter carried an almost sacred quiet. People stepped outside, looked at the stars, and listened to the soft dripping of melting ice. They no longer feared the darkness, for the balance had shifted. The night had softened, its bite dulled. In that silence, they could rest not from exhaustion but from awe. You look around now at the sleeping world. The fields glisten under the moon, the roofs drip slowly, and the faint scent of thawed soil rises like incense. Somewhere, a dog barks once, then falls silent. The fire beside you crackles low, the wood collapsing gently into embers. It feels like the final sigh of a season that has tested every heart and left it stronger. For the medieval sleeper, this was the moment of peace. The cold no longer prowled through the walls. The fears that haunted long nights, the hunger, the draughts, the endless creak of ice had begun to fade. What remained was gratitude, soft and wordless. Families drifted to sleep knowing that tomorrow would not be quite so cold, that the sun would return a little earlier, and that the world was, once again, on their side. You stretch your hands toward the last of the fire's glow. The air smells faintly of wood and melting snow. Your breath